This is literally what picks me up off the floor when I am destroyed by staring at the screaming abyss and feel like there's no point to any of it.
What is that? Yeah.
It is seek novelty, make art, help out.
I think you gotta have a dream.
The School of Greatness.
Really?
Yeah.
Please welcome Lewis House.
Very excited about this. You've got an amazing new book out that is gonna transform lives and blow people's minds, called Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind. Why have we lost our minds in the first place?
I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, and they're all happening at once. So basically, the world has gone exponential, and it is both getting exponentially better. So if you think of Steven Pinker, if you think of inspirational TED Talks, you can be like, hey, literacy's up, poverty's down, war is down, health is, all these things are trending in the right direction. And you can honestly and authentically feel like this is the best of times. And then you open the paper and you see wildfires and floods and pandemics and social unrest and protest, and you think, oh my God, this is the worst of times. And toggling back and forth between that is crazy making. And because they're both exponential, it's damn near impossible to figure out exactly where we reside, right? Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if there's sort of two arcs to life. I mean, I experience this, I don't know if you do, but the difference, in fact, E.B. White, right, the guy who wrote Charlotte's Web, that old kid's book, he has this beautiful quote where he says, I wake up in the morning torn between savoring the world and saving it. And that can make it hard to plan my days.
Ooh.
Right? And then he says, and then I realized, in fact, that the savoring has to come first.
The savoring?
Yes, the savoring, because if I didn't have a world to savor, then there would be nothing worth saving.
Right. The challenge is, it seems like a lot of people are in this, the world is ending, or it seems like with the media, the world is ending, how do I fix everything or save something? As opposed to, how do I enjoy what I have right now?
Yeah. And that's the whole, totally in the power of now, people say, oh my gosh, being in time with causation, like what's happened in the past, what's happening now, what's happening next, that's super stressful, or we get knocked off our center, so just be here now. Ram Dass too, right? Like, and you're like, yeah, kind of. Like being present, super important, but we are time-traveling space monkeys, right? We have the ability to conceptualize past, present, future, and at a minimum, because we're 17 degrees off the axis of the sun, unless you're at the equator, we have seasons, right? So that forced us to be thinking there's times of famine and there's times of feast. There's times of abundant photons from our nearest star and not so abundant chlorophyll and metabolism. So we have to plan, right? So if you just go cross-eyed and zen about it, it's inadequate to deal with linear time's arrow, right? But if you forget to be present, right, then there's nothing to savor.
So what do we need? Both?
Well, yeah, I mean, no surprise, right? But it's not a beige middle, right? That's unsatisfying. It's much more like, Hegel, right, the German philosopher. It's a dialectic. It's forever back and forth between the guardrails. And how do we dynamically steer based on what on earth is in front of us? What are we paying attention to and what needs to get done? So like hypothermic people don't make very good poets, right? So you're like, okay, I might want to put on a jacket, right? Right. I might want to rub two sticks together and get a fire going. Now I can have access to greater creativity or expanse. So, it feels like to boil all that down, there's the sort of coming alive arc, right? Which is what we were all raised on. Anyone go up to be president or an astronaut and sort of hashtag best life, right? We all deserve to be healed, whole, and healthy. We deserve to travel the world. We deserve to have unique experiences. We deserve to have amazing soulmate, twin flame relationships, the whole bit, right? And the entire baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, we were all raised on that, right? And it's beautiful, uplifting, and inspiring. It's always been partial, and not everybody's even had access to that promise, but it's pretty awesome. And that's about expanding, infinite timeframes and expansion of possibility, right? So if you were at a picnic at the beach, you'd be like, okay, what do we pack? What's gonna be the most amazing lunch ever? What blanket do we take? Where do we lay it out for the nicest view? That's the coming alive arc. But then there is also, and again, most folks through human history have had to wrestle with this. It's just the bubble generations, after World War II until lately, like say 2008. right? So boomers, Xers, and millennials, who we really grew up in this historical anomaly in the developed West. It's never been nicer. You know, all war was externalized, massive, insane upward upticks of consumerism, standards of living, education, cheap debt, you name it, all that great stuff. And we're experiencing the intersection of like the staying alive arc. And the staying alive arc is the exact opposite. It starts high and goes down across the chart. And that's about the diminishing of timeframes and resources and options.
Meaning we don't need to work as hard to stay alive.
Well, no, like triage, like, oh, so staying alive is you picnic at the beach, you're like, wait a second, all the ocean's getting sucked out to sea. Wait, why are all the animals fleeing to higher ground? Like, what's that phone warning going on in my phone? Oh, it's a tsunami. Now what do we do with our day at the beach? So the coming alive arc and the staying alive arc are like intersecting right about now. And you can lie in bed. I mean, I've had this experience.
Interesting.
I've had this experience like 3 or 4 times.
So the world was ending and the world was the best it could ever be at the same time.
And what do I do with my day? How do I plan my day?
Right.
So I'll be lying in bed and I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's such a phenomenal, travel idea. We'd like to go do something amazing, an adventure to plan, an entrepreneurial idea, a creative project. You're like,
book.
yay, yeah, amazing, so inspired.
And we're in a pandemic.
I know, you're like, oh shit, do we even get to? Do we even get to? Or should we be doing canned goods and should I be researching getting solar panels on our roof? Or should we be fucking off to Costa Rica because the wheels are coming off Austin? We've been without power for 2 weeks.
That's crazy.
So that, right? It's like Chinatown, like that Jack Nicholson thing with Faye Dunaway. She's my mother, she's my sister, she's my mother, she's my sister. It's that schizophrenic toggling between what is the frame or the lens that explains the data I'm experiencing and gives me clarified direction to act, right? And so that's a meaning crisis.
So we're lacking meaning.
Well, we have lost the handrails or the trusted institutions, right? So we've had a collapse in both benign authority, like secular, so academic institutions,
religion,
corporate. That's divine authority. So we've got benign authority on the side of like everything from your doctor, your friendly white-coated family doctor is the one who got your cousin hooked on OxyContin and has your little son Billy pinballing off the walls on high industrial strength amphetamines for his entire life,
or Adderall or something. Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson and maybe your nervous spouse who's been poleaxed by benzos like Klonopin, and you're like, wait, that's called iatrogenic illness. And the Lancet just published a study saying something like 21 million people worldwide suffer from iatrogenic illness, which is just fancy for your doctor f***ed up and didn't admit it. So you're like, okay, so we can't trust those guys. Academia with like, the Ivy League admissions scandals, peer review crisis, replication crisis in social sciences. So you're like, oh, that stuff's not so trustworthy. What about the captains of industry, McKinsey and Goldman? You listen to The Big Short and you're like, oh, whoops, Goldman was like selling credit default swaps out the front door and hedging it in the back door. They were totally implicated in the 1MDB Singapore scandal. Right, McKinsey was fined for partnering with Jacob Zuma in South Africa and and the Gupta brothers and siphoning $7 billion out of the South African treasury and potentially collapsing Mandela's entire post-apartheid project. They just got clipped a month ago for conspiring with Purdue Pharma to help sell more OxyContin after it was already determined to be completely addictive and underpinning the opioid crisis. So you're like, wait, this is where the best and brightest from all the Ivies go to get their internships, to get their, to go play the game. Yeah. And that's hollow.
And you got the political side of things.
Politics, WHO, CDC, all these things. So and there's no more even Walter Cronkite or BBC Radio. It used to be like, okay, world's crazy out there. Vietnam War, civil rights, whatever.
Source?
7 p.m. We all sit down and literally a sane, rational voice of reason who's a neutral arbiter of all things good, true, and beautiful will sit down and tell us what's what. That's gone. Even Snopes and fact-checking sites have become politicized. You go to the journals of record, like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. They've got increasingly partisan editors, op-eds, boards, and readers. And no one recognizes or respects any information coming from out of those. So that's always been a shorthand for what is considered consensus opinion. So that's just been boom. And at the same time, We've had the collapse in organized religion.
Yeah.
Right. So Pew Research Foundation, I think it was in 2015, but it's only been continuing, which was the rise of the nuns. So like NONES, the none of the aboves. Fastest growing and now for the first time ever largest religious affiliation in North America. So it used to be you would always anchor off, loosely or tightly, some family of faith, some family of origin, belief system, and authority structure.
And now it's none is what people are saying.
NONEs, right? And so now, and you've got the sexual abuse scandals, you've got 1,001 things undermining all of that, right? So what we're seeing is, as we've seen this collapse of the roof of shared meaning, we're in a vacuum, and we're getting fundamentalism on one side, and we're getting nihilism on the other side.
Nihilism is?
Like, I believe in nothing. So like Tyler Durden in Fight Club.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're the middle children of history, man. Our great war is a spiritual war. We were told we were going to get to grow up to be presidents and rock stars, and we're not, and we're pissed.
So screw it all. Make it our own game, yeah.
Yeah, one in three millennials surveyed within the last couple of years believes that actually military rule would be preferable to democracy. Right? And
is that because they're seeking order or structure or some type of leadership?
Well, there was a great piece in The Atlantic, and it was basically saying, look, this generation, they commit fewer crimes, they have less premarital sex, they drink less, party less, they do all the bad things less. They go to college in historic rates. They have historic amounts of student debt. They've done everything right, and they've been handed this steaming shitbag of society and ecology. And he said, so no wonder the kids want to say, burn it all down. So you're like, okay, so that's the lie of the land. And at the same time, back to the picnic on the beach during the tsunami thing, our spidey senses are all a tingle, right? Everybody knows that business as usual, and not just the old narratives, but the old structures are cracking. And as a result, on a sort of primal animal level, everybody's hopped up and wound up about what do we do now. And so the question is, you would think or hope, like, okay, and we were talking about this earlier, right? Like, in times of great crisis, we rally, and whether this is FDR and the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, or you have Winston Churchill and never, ever, ever give up and, keep calm and carry on. Like, and in the beginning of COVID, right, people started trotting those out. Like, is this going to be another one of those? And you're like, yeah, maybe, no, really, no, not at all. So at a time when a meta crisis, meaning it's not just one thing.
It's everything.
Right? It's economic, it's political, it's geopolitical, it's ecological.
Health.
Right? It's all of the things, all at once, intersecting, overlapping, and catalyzing.
Oh, man.
Right? It's a
lot of trauma that's being built up in every human being around the world.
It's an awful lot. And I actually, funnily enough, it was Tim Ferriss that inspired this. He had put out in one of his newsletters a TED Talk that he said made him cry, right? And I was like, oh, great, let me check it out. Like it moved the fella, I'm curious too. And it was that, I think his name is Sam Berners. He's a little bald-headed kid who had a congenital condition from birth, and he basically knew he wasn't long for this world. And he gave this totally bad, and he was all of like 65 pounds soaking wet, but he became a Boy Scout, and he wanted to play in the marching band, and he told bad puns and made hip-hop jokes. And I mean, it's just an awesome, just one of those testaments to life through tragedy, right? And I watched that like 4 days before I had to give a talk at a Futures conference in Austin. And I just tore up my speech, and I was like, okay, and this was right when there had been some of those really, like the UN reports for 2020 of saying, hey, we got 10 years, folks, otherwise this is a wheels off situation, right? So I really thought long and hard about it and tried to come up with a 15-minute talk that addressed this, right? And right. where's the path for courage? Where's the path for hope? All this stuff. Gave the talk, and it was the opener. It was the opening keynote, and it went over like a lead balloon. This was all crypto, psychedelic, blockchain, blah, future, yay.
Yeah.
Like
going in outer space. And
like pitching the conference is like, this is if Ted and Burning Man had a baby.
Sure.
And I'm like, well, okay, if Ted and Burning Man had a baby, then you're the people that we need to have this conversation, right? And one of the founders came up to me no sooner as I got off stage, and he just hissed at me. He's like, "You don't give a do
What?
you?"
No, he did not.
He absolutely did, and they stiffed me. This is like which was really, really funny. Like, I've never had that happen in my life, and I spent an entire week building a this wasn't like a pull it off the shelf stump speech. You know, you could give and it was completely from the heart to try and address all this.
Wow.
So I went home in the fetal position.
When was this? 2020?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Right. So I was like, what did I do wrong? Like, how did I f this up so badly? And it occurred to me, I was like, oh, I just totally misjudged three things. Right? Why did I get this allergic reaction from an audience that would otherwise should have been primed for this conversation? And it was, first was cognitive complexity, right? Pretty much what we've just been talking about. Exponential everything in different directions, right? Because what we're missing is exponential meaning. You've got exponential quantum computing, you've got exponential cryptocurrencies, you've got exponential learning with Khan Academy and distributed online, exponential transportation with Uber copters, we've got exponential biology with CRISPR, and everything is exponential, except how to make sense of it all. So I was like, okay, so our capacity to hold multiple competing and conflicting ideas simultaneously without crashing our mental browser or shitting the bed. right? So like, that's one thing, right? And basically, you can address that with a sort of fairly tidy thing, which is like a triangle of like a post-conventional metaphysics. So like, how could we all just kind of upload? Because I mean, short answer is get educated, right? Like good old-fashioned Plato and Socrates 101, like learn how to think. But we don't all have time for that, right? So if you have a little triangle where you're like, okay, Pascal's wager, Occam's razor, and Bayesian probability. So you're like, Pascal's wager is basically, he famously said, better to believe in God in case he's real, right? Than to be an atheist and get doomed to hell forever if I'm wrong. So best, moral is better at least conceive of the inconceivable just in case, right? So better to conceive of the inconceivable. Is there a global cabal of Satanist pedophiles running the world? Well, I don't know. It seems a long shot, but maybe. Let me at least keep an eye on that. Are we possibly at the end of the Anthropocene era, and this is the extinction of humanoids on this little Earth form? Maybe. Might want to keep tabs on that. Is this the unraveling of the nation state? Perhaps. Is this the collapse of global economy? Perhaps. There's all sorts of things that it would be better for me to at least keep tabs on.
Be aware of,
than to be arrogantly dismissive.
Right.
So that's step one. Once you've let that in the gate, so you've conceived of some of the inconceivables, then you got Occam's razor, which is the simplest solution is usually the best, right? So rather than, once again, global conspiracies of satanic pedophiles, you might just say, hey, maybe the system is bankrupt and we've been getting lied to. And maybe there are systemic structures, and maybe there's a bunch of different cabals or small groups conspiring, but they always slam into each other, cancel each other out, do anything. But the idea of some sinister, centralized thing, potentially unlikely.
Right.
Or we're all, or there's going to be UFO contact, or and I just did a bunch of psychedelics. I'm now convinced that the Galactic Federation is going to come and land and fix everything. The Occam's razor explanation is I was on drugs that night. Right? So let's hold that one first and foremost, like before we go leaping to conclusions. So Occam's razor is always just don't get into excessively baroque or complex or self-indulgent explanations which require connecting 17 dots to Sunday. Let's bust it all down and say the WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, is always a very high bar to go beyond.
Yeah. That's two.
Right,
yeah.
That's two. And then the foundation is Bayesian probability, right? And Bayesian probability is just to say, hey, nothing worse than false certainty in a complex situation. So map your equation of all the bits and pieces that might be contributing, and then basically delay. It's a little bit like Tai Chi or martial arts, where you put out a foot, but you don't weight it. Because if you put all your weight on your front foot, then your opponent can sweep you, right, and take you to the ground. So the idea is like, I'm going to put my foot there, but I can also pick my foot up, right? So Bayesian probability is saying, pay attention to all the variables and constantly update them with the latest, most trustworthy information you have, and delay making binding decisions for as long as possible.
Right. Get it peer tested, all that stuff. Yeah.
So that's the first one is do we have the cognitive complexity to hold it without overwhelming our emotions, our nervous systems, and our sense making, and and screen of death, right? Rainbow wheel of death, like just crashing our browser. So, because if it crashes, we tend to get bored, we get irritated, or we just say, That's all too much to think about. So I'm just going with this one. And then we ignore a whole lot of reality and potential impacts. The next one is are we willing to kill our sacred cows?
Meaning what?
So our sacred cows, right, it comes from India, but the idea of like you can't touch those ones because they're holy, right? And we just talked about a few, right? If I believe that, and this is like Francis Fukuyama, like back in 1989, he wrote that book, The End of History and the Last Man, because it was basically the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was that kind of moment from like fall of the Berlin Wall, I guess that was 91, I think he might have written this in 89, but like, so right around that era, we won the Cold War, yay. Right? McDonald's and democracy for everyone. And free markets and democracy are the pinnacle of human civilizational attainment, and they're a steady state. Like, this is it. This is the top of the hill. Right? We've got here. We've arrived. History has literally ended. Now we're just scaling, improvising, tweaking perfection. And that worked right up until you could say, you even have the invasions of Iraq, the Arab Spring, that idea of like, we're going to topple all the despots and the bad guys and the dictators, and then, citizenship and democracy will arise in their place. Like, whoops, well, that didn't quite happen. And now we have all these ideas of what we took as sacrosanct, right, is now up for grabs. I mean, even in this last election cycle, there were a number of conservative politicians starting to tweet, hey, by the way, reminder, this is not a democracy, this is a republic. Like softening the ground for like voting suppression and things like that. You're like, whoa. like what, like, and how did something like a global pandemic, which was supposed to, we would naturally expect a globally coordinated response, and for sure a national effort, not factionalizing states and pitting different political governors against each other, and like, you guys can rot, but we're going to look after our people. Like, mind-blowing stuff. Things that go, we're a democracy and we're talking about actively suppressing votes, not gerrymandering and the kind of backroom deals that have always happened, but like saying the quiet parts out loud. And you're like, wait a second, what's that about? Or the fact that the earth is forever bountiful. We might actually run it out. We're at peak sand, right?
Peak sand?
Peak sand. Like that whole notion of go pound sand, right? Literally, like China has built more in the last 3 years than the United States, has poured more concrete in the last 3 years than the United States did in the entire 20th century.
Shut up.
I'm not. And
oh my gosh.
And they're having to import sand from Saudi Arabia because and they're also mining sand in India to ship to China. We are running out of construction sand in the world. So you're like, oh wow. Like so there's so many things, and then even just take, not like this was our father's generation, but the whole 20 years in a gold watch. I pick a company,
right?
I put my head down, I work my way up the ladder, and then I get a retirement and a pension. Well, that got blown up with the privatize everything and do your 401k.
Right.
Now you just do your dollar cost averaging and you match your matching funds and you save and you invest in mutual funds because no one can plan the stock market, and don't get freaked in ups and downs because it always comes back over time, right? That whole story. And now you've got baby boomers that are just simply shit out of luck and having to work convenience store jobs for the extra spending money and health insurance. 1 in 3 millennials has a side hustle just to make things, so like the American dream of home ownership, well, that's gone. We're doing Airbnbs now. Car ownership, no, we're doing Ubers and scooters. Marriage, no, we're doing Tinder and right,
hookup culture
and Bumble. Yeah. Like all of these things have been externalized and outsourced. Right? So almost the global systemic, where there's all sorts of things that we took as sacrosanct, our sacred cows, and on the personal, like what did I think my life was going to entail? Right? That we're having to take long, hard looks at. And it's that whole, 100-year, like the 100-year, 1,000-year flood, 10-year flood kind of thing, floods and fires, right? For a long time, you're like, oh, sweet, well, we're at the 1,000-year floodplain. We're bulletproof, except that, right? We've been having 100-year weather events several times a decade lately. So you're like, oh, shit, okay. So, and Churchill said it nicely. He said, plans are worthless, but planning is priceless. So that notion of having some estimation, like our old rulers or yardsticks are kind of getting blown out of the water. We're experiencing accelerating change. The word unprecedented gets used so often these days. Right. Unseasonable, unprecedented, all these things. And you're like, yep, that's now enough. We have to come up with new adjectives or new yardsticks.
Right.
But having some sense of what do we think is coming? gives us and based on what has happened in the past, right? That's what foresters do for fires. That's what civil engineers do.
But we don't know what's
for
coming
fires.
now.
No, but we can run back to the planning is priceless. It's a little bit like choose your own apocalypse, like Mad Max libs, right? Fill in the blanks as you choose to give yourself a story
To plan and prepare.
that matches your model of reality.
Interesting.
And at least then you're not in fibrillation.
What are you planning for?
Well, I mean,
What's your apocalypse?
well, my personal sense is if you run like the cold game theory analysis, just kind of like almost like not even Homo economicus, but like Homo Machiavellius. Like what the fuck happens if everybody's acting out of self-interest and we just kind of do the things we seem to continue doing? Then there's an awful lot of trend lines that don't pencil out happily right now.
If we're all competing against each other, going after our own, trying to take what's ours mentality.
And collapsing into factionalism and tribalism and all of those things. Not to just mention the pigs and the python, like the things that even if we all had an Ebenezer Scrooge night tonight, we go to sleep and we have our ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, and we wake up, like Paul on the road to Damascus. I've seen the light, and we all promise to change and do everything right from here on. It's still going to get catastrophically worse before it could get better.
Why?
Well, just because there's a lot of inertia in our systems, right? And it's going to take decades plus to flush through all that. So like I said, even if we suddenly became some cross between Stephen Hawking and Mother Teresa and Elon Musk tomorrow, and throw in the Dalai Lama while we're at it, right? So if we just became that collectively and we did everything right, we are still going to have a hard landing.
Really?
Yeah. So the question is just, is it an inferno? Do we lose the landing gear, right? Or do we end up, in a belly slide on the grass, and how many people get off, right? So you're like, okay, so my sense is hard saying not knowing. Like it is too complex to know for sure. And I mean, my background's in like mountain guiding and wilderness medicine and that kind of stuff. So I always just think super literally. Like if you're in the mountains and you can sleep warm and dry. So like you've got a sleeping bag that's protected from the elements. You can suffer a lot during the day and you can recover. If you have adequate food, if you have a fuel source,
clean drinking water,
navigation, so like maps and compass, and medical, right? If you have those things, then like the Seattle Mountaineers have a bumper sticker that says, "Your worst nightmare is my vacation," right? So you can go push it, and you can engage. You can climb into the pain cave. You can have the sufferfest, and it can actually be really enjoyable. And you can even choose hard objectives that are totally optional. Like let's go climb that wild crazy thing just to see if we can, because it looks beautiful and treacherous, right? You can actually take on additional challenge, but lose your water filter, break your stove, watch your sleeping bag roll down a ravine into a river and disappear, and then suddenly you're in cascading triage to like, oh, we now have to beat a retreat to the trailhead and get back to civilization.
Right.
So we just saw this in Austin, right? There was this freak snowstorm, power, the entire Texas grid overloaded, and was literally 4 minutes and 35 seconds from a meltdown crash that would have taken like over a month to rebuild. It was that close. And at the same time, virtually nobody has alternate or backup heat sources. It's all electric because they barely ever need it. And then all the pipes froze, and then we also had a collapse in sanitized water. So there was boil water notices, there was some people straight up didn't have any, the whole thing. And you're like, oh, who was it? There's a fellow at the UN that said this beautifully, which was, we're only ever 5 missed meals from total anarchy. Right?
Like a day and a half.
Yeah.
If you don't eat for a day and a half, you're like, you're not thinking clearly, you're freaking out, you're stealing, you're freaking beating people.
And the doodly-doodly-doo neighborly just goes.
No, it's just like, I'm going to go and break in and take some food.
Yeah. So my sense is like,
how did Texas handle it from your perspective?
Well, I mean,
people coming together and saying,
some folks did. Some folks did.
Come stay here. And
I think it's important to celebrate and spotlight those things. Right, because we obviously need more of that, and there was toughness. Right, there's the same things that we see in stable systems of imbalance. That there's always there's absolutely the notion of environmental racism, which is simply that dispossessed, disempowered communities are almost always getting the shortest end of the stick when it comes to where the trash dump is, where the Superfund site is, who has, Flint, Michigan, drinking water, you name it, and then throw in crises and the interruption of services and then the restoration of services, and then that also gets laid over exactly those same patterns and dynamics. So there are folks that, pissed off to nice locations on private planes or
to Cabo or whatever,
charter planes or whatever, right? And that happens. People with mobility, people with disposable income, people with advanced intel or information and news, all those things help. So the question is how do we rally ourselves together? And I think for anybody that considers themselves like some form of a leader, for your family and your household, for your community, all these kind of things. There's kind of a sliding scale, right? If I can look after myself, and that's, biohacking, peak performance, if I can sleep, rest, nutrition, mindset, all those things, and I've got enough gas in my tank left over, then I can be a loving and engaging member of my family.
But if I don't have those things?
If I have a concussion, or I have, a diabetic blood sugar crash, or I have a depressive episode, or some mental health challenge, or an addiction, then boom, I'm decompensated, and I'm back to having to deal with me first. But let's say I get me sorted, then my sphere of concern can expand to my family. Let's say my family is more or less thriving and happy, then I've got more left over. I can start caring for my community, caring for my country, caring for the world. And that is a sliding scale based on basically stability and access to energy and resources. So again, I could be a leader of the world and get hit on the head with a hammer, and I'm back to self-care. And it also has an expansion of concern and time frame, which is I get hit on the head with a hammer, it's me now.
Nothing else matters
Nothing else matters
healing
except
the pain.
crack in my skull, right? If I'm in a plane crash with my family, it's me and mine now, right? If we are slightly better off than that, we're now on the desert island, it's me and mine now and next, right? And you can
Maybe
see
we'll have a helping
an
hand,
expansion of how many people I care for over what kind of a time frame, immediate versus longer term, all the way to, like Bodhisattva, everyone, everywhere, every when. Right? And you're not only just caring for humans now, but maybe all sentient beings now. You're maybe not even caring for all sentient beings now. You're kind of caring for everyone that's ever been and everyone that's ever gonna.
Leaving the place better than you found it.
Well, yeah, I mean, and a lot of ethicists talk about that, like the idea between what's an existential crisis for humanity versus just a really, really road ahead. Because their point is...
What's the difference?
Well, and it's pretty academic for us, because my sense is that the only thing that actually matters as far as human choices is my generation and my kids' generation. After that, it's academic. But ethicists will say, hey, an extinction event of humanity doesn't just mean everybody on Earth snuffs it. It means that every other human that is yet to be born but was going to be has snuffed it.
Interesting.
So you get this aggregate cost when you terminate a species line through a keyhole event, right? And that's inconceivably exponentially bigger as far as the loss.
Yeah.
So my sense would be is, can we first look after ourselves and our families, so that, right, like put our houses in order, so that we can then come back to the front lines and be helpful.
How do we do that if we don't have a meaning anymore? If we don't trust authorities, trust the organized religions or politics or corporations, if that's all fractured and broken now, how do we find meaning of why we're even here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that answer that's unique for everybody, right? It has to be. And any tops-down answers, no matter how good they sound at the beginning, almost always devolve into some form of fascism over time, right? So a question is like, hey, if like meaning 1.0, right, we can call that like traditional religion, offered salvation, right? Here's the story of how you get to heaven, right? But at the price of exclusion, right? It was those who believed were saved, those who didn't weren't. So it was kind of a harsh approach, but it was fair. Like it was like we're going to lay our cards on the table exactly how we're going to play this game.
Do this and you're saved. Don't do this and you're not
you're
saved.
stuffed. You are not in the tree of trust.
Right.
And then meaning 2.0, which we could say is sort of like the French Enlightenment on, the modern liberalism, civil rights, civil liberties, private property, markets, that whole thing, said, that whole salvation game, that's problematic. That's led to holy wars, all inquisitions, all of this, and superstition and all this bad stuff. So we're not gonna do that. We're gonna do inclusion. Everybody gets to play this game, at least in theory, right? At the cost of salvation, right? Separation of church and state, and Nietzsche's sort of God is dead, right? And both of and that hasn't worked out too well either, right? Because an awful lot of people have correctly said, well, because the story was sort of like, wait your turn, play by the rules, and your turn will come. We promise, right? And you're getting a lot of frustration and understandable even rage at the imbalances of that game. Like we were sold a bill of goods, and in fact, Joseph Stiglitz, who's he was World Bank, UN economic advisor, all sorts of incredibly high up positions. I mean, he basically just called the entire shell game. He's like it's been 40 years and the results are in. Neoliberalism and democracy have broken, and the benefits have accrued asymmetrically to those at the top. And in the last year, we've seen all sorts of things about what kind of recession are we in because of quarantine. Is it going to be a U-shaped or a V-shaped or a K-shaped, right? And a K-shape just means that the top 1% are now trillion and gazillionaires,
right? And
everybody else is hosed. And I mean, to put this really, to put a point on it, this blew my mind. I had written the first chapter of this book 18 months ago. And I had a paragraph, and it said, when 68 people on the planet
are richer than
hold as much wealth as the bottom half, the bottom 4 billion.
That's crazy.
Right? 68 people could all fit on a bus, one bus.
They have more money than half of the...
than half of the world's population. And then just to note that, that sort of asymmetrical accumulation of resources, energy credits, like natural resources, it occurs in no living system anywhere, ever. Now that was 18 months ago, just before we went to press. I had to just go back and fact check. The number,
how many is it now?
It's 27. They can fit in a stretch limo.
Oh my gosh, 27 have
27
more
humans.
Money and more resources than the bottom
4 billion.
4 billion people in the
4
planet.
billion people. Now that just should break our hearts.
Does that excite you to show what possibilities you could create potentially for yourself, or should that break our hearts?
I mean, in some respects, this is the other thing. I think the era of I think a good thing for us to think of is that physics trumps metaphysics all day long. So whether you're a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian, free market-y guy, whether you're somebody who's all about particular neo-Marxist theories or interpretations, whether you're some new age consciousness, it's sort of going to be like, guys, I think it's time. Like it's at the poker table. It's a call. Like it's time. Lay your cards down, because we're about to see what happens, and it won't be talking heads getting to spin their take. Right? There's going to be a lot of surprised faces going, oh, okay, I guess this happened, or this is happening. So whether that's climate alarmists or denialists, like we're going to see, whether that's social, whether it's nationalism is the best thing or globalism, like we're going to see, whether these markets are stable or inflationary or deflationary or efficient or totally inefficient, and there's tons of rent seeking and capture, and we're dealing in late stage capitalism is a total sham compared to the ideal of a free market. We'll see. So there's all sorts of things that in the coming few decades we're simply just going to experience physically. It's the whole sort of
physics.
Mike Tyson, right? Like everybody's got a plan to get
punched in the face.
Yeah, right. We're about to take some shots.
We've been taking shots, right?
Yeah. Well, and I would even say that weirdly, because a number of people have sort of approached me over the last 6 months and been like, "Oh, dude, this is right, like you called it. This is all happening exactly as you said." And I'm like, "No. Actually, this was a total surprise. In fact, I haven't, just to my own sanity, and not to be a total buzzkill at parties, I wasn't even deeply monitoring global pandemic risks. You knew kind of there's these, favelas in Sao Paulo and crazy uber slums in Africa and Lagos and Shanghai, and that those were going to be hotbed incubators of the next wild pathogen.
But you didn't think it was going to be globally this soon.
Well, it's just like, look, you can only wrap your head around so many wild-ass things and still be sociable.
You're like, this is going to crumble, and this is going to crumble in the next decade, but not this and everything else.
So this, to me, was a total flyer. But and the crazy thing is that actually has nothing to do with the underlying structural conditions that are still the blaring red alarm.
Right.
Gosh, right. So this is merely a dress rehearsal, mid-level, totally manageable thing. We're fucking up terribly.
right.
Meanwhile,
everything else is falling apart.
Yeah. So the questions is
do you think this is a good thing that's happened this soon and not delayed suffering and pain? Is it good that we're seeing this now, the pandemic? I mean, obviously it's not good when people are dying and suffering and things are happening, but in the overall scheme of the world and healing and awareness and reinventing ourselves, is this necessary?
Yeah, I mean, and those kind of comforting just so narratives, right? Don't worry, cupcake, it's all going to be okay because here's the bigger plan or story, right? Everything happens for a reason, those kind of things. I have a hard time sinking my teeth into those. Because how on earth do we know? And I think in some respects, I guess if I had to kind of define how I might look at things, it's a little bit more like a transcendental existentialism, right? So the existentialism part is life is utterly meaningless, right? That, Camus said it famously in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. He said the only serious question is whether or not to commit suicide, right? So you actually have to stare into the screaming abyss. You have to be like, okay, strip it all out, right? Jack Nicholson in Few Good Men. You want the truth, you can't handle the truth, right? You got to actually go stare into the screaming abyss and understand that we are just monkeys with clothes on a little rock next to an irrelevant generic star circling around.
Floating in infinite space.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. It's horrifying, right? And there are these moments of sublime grace, beauty, and potentiality, and we are the existential mayflies of this universe with opposable thumbs and prefrontal cortexes, and we're here for like 8 or 9 decades on a good run, like to fight and to f- and to grieve and to build and to create and destroy and to be alive, and like, holy shit, we're alive. And that part, like holding and cherishing that part, at the same time as holding the profound grief, which, by the way, is the third leg of the stool we talked about too, which was complexity, sacred cows. And then as we do this, this is actually the appropriate point in this conversation, which is once we've stared into the screaming abyss and we realize that we've just been whistling past the graveyard, right? It's kind of scary, so I'm going to whistle a little song and hopefully that keeps whatever's really big and scary away. Like, really? Like, what does that do? Right? It's a little bit like all the True Blood movies and all the hit vampire movies where someone invariably like spritzes them with holy water or makes a crucifix and they're like, are you kidding? You believe that old wives' tale? Like, no, we're way hipper than that.
Yeah.
Right? So like our monsters, I think, are actually far stronger than our superstitious warning.
Yeah, you got to get to the heart to kill us.
Yeah, right? And so the question is how do we learn to weep, not whimper, right? We're so, like, whether it's trigger warnings.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is fibrillation versus, like, eustress versus distress, right? So, like, most people think when they see, like, whatever, Grey's Anatomy or things like that, right? Or ER or House, right? The idea of, like, paddles, clear, right? Those things, that's to start somebody's heart. It's not. It's actually to stop someone's heart. Because what's happening in those situations is ventricular fibrillation, which means their heart is in a spasm, which will kill them, right? And so what they're doing is they're zapping it to flatline it, so that then the brain impulses and start back up and resets, right? And we are in ventricular fibrillation. Psychologically, socially, politically, we're all experiencing micro PTSD. And you look on Twitter, you look on social feeds, you look at the amount of bad faith inflammation. We're just looking for excuses, dying for excuses to misread someone's intent, take it wildly out of context, and just unload rage, grief. And it just because our nervous systems are in fibrillation, right? So And that's the whimpering, that's the whining. We're collapsing into these who can play the victim card
the most.
And there's been an interesting study, and I haven't gone back to look at the actual paper, but a friend just told me this yesterday, which was there's a correlation between playing victimhood identities, like seeking that mindset, and dark triad, narcissistic, Machiavellian, sociopathic personality types. So now you've got bad actors going, the help, help, I'm being oppressed, right? Simply because it's a highly effective power play right now. And then you have legitimately huge populations that are being victimized by conditions in life that absolutely need infinite care, compassion, and support that aren't getting it because we're in this fibrillated state. So the weep, don't whimper is open our hearts to the wounds of the world and feel it, right? Because it connects us to ourselves, it connects us to each other, and it connects us to our courage and our purpose. And then get the back up.
Right.
And let's do our part.
Right. We're here for a reason. Let's figure it out.
Yeah.
Let's figure out what this is. What should we be having faith in?
Well,
should we have faith?
Yeah. Well, that's such a good question and such a good word because.
And is it blind faith? Is it just, well, this is what our grandparents told our parents, and this is what the book says, and this is what our God says, or whatever, so we just trust it blindly?
Yeah, I mean, I think those days are gone, right? I mean, there's such a spike in cynicism, and there's a collapse in benign and divine authority. So we can't really kind of go back and dust them off and reboot them and prop them back up again. We've kind of seen that they're like, Potemkin villages, like back in the Stalinist days, where they would take people driving through Moscow, and then they would literally do like almost like theater stage sets. Those were called, right? To look like they were really robust and thriving. So we kind of have seen that a lot institutions that we took to be solid and timeless are Potemkin villages.
Right. We're seeing
you can't unsee that.
We're seeing how the sausage is made and everything.
Yeah. And it's thoroughly disappointing. In fact, I mean, I think there would be an amazing kumbaya situation if you took alt-right conspiracy theorists and far-left conspiracy theorists and you said, hey guys, let's just get together because the diagnosis of the problem is 90% aligned. It's you can't trust elite institutions. We've been being fed a bill of goods. All media and messaging is massaged and positioned, and we're supposed to just take it. There's a sort of dual layer system of politics and power, and really, this is Noam Chomsky's critique from way back when, right? But I mean, it comes from both sides. All those things, and the common man is getting a bill of goods. Fill it in. I mean, Bernie in 2016 and Trump in 2016, their analysis of what was wrong with America was at least 80% identical. Now, their prescription as to what we ought to do, who's to blame, and what we should do next about it, those go very differently, right? And so getting folks together on the shared playing field is I just think it's helpful, and it also clears away the noise and the clutter, because it's like that last 10% is the whole ball game as to who's to blame and what should we do now. Right, and that's where that's where you really have to slow the tape.
And what do we believe in?
Yeah. That's where you have to get very, very specific. Because I mean, an example that I can't get out of my head. It just seems to be such a strong one. It's like Charlie Manson. Like I watched it. There was a documentary in like 1973. It was all original footage. It wasn't like a CBS like after school special with actors, and it's idyllic. It's naked, blonde-haired hippies like smoking weed by the waterfalls in Topanga and like hanging out and doing the whole thing, right? And you're like, oh my gosh! And then you hear them interviewed, and again, 90% of what they had to say, they said, hey, you come out of the 50s, the Eisenhower Industrial Complex. You're trying to please your parents. You don't even know who you are. You need to get clear on what your purpose is, what your sexuality is, what your joy is. You're like, yes, check, and then up is down, down is up. And you're like, kind of interesting. They're tripping. Maybe we'll give them that one, and then life is death, and death is life. Wow, maybe on a kind of like super Zen point of view, perhaps, and then kill the pigs. And you're like, oh wait, that part. Right? And so we're seeing that with anti-vax conspiracies. We're seeing that with QAnon. We're seeing that with New Age, like we're all going to vibrate up to the next density and leave behind this earth form or all the chubby people who don't eat at Erewhon's and Whole Foods. Right? That whole thing you're like, whoa, slow the tape right there. Because like you can have psychedelic fascism, you can have ethno-nationalism, you can have, there's all sorts of pathological places these go. Right? And if you're not aware of the philosophical and ethical implications baked into what all sounds reasonable at 100,000 feet, but you actually start trying to put them on the ground and you're like, oh man, those don't go to happy places. So to your point about faith, right? How do we create a meaning 3.0?
Yes.
Right? That takes the promise of salvation, right? Because without salvation, right, people who grew up as nuns, people who grew up as atheists, people who grew up unchurched, right? Have succumbed to
N-O-N-E.
Yes, N-O-N-E, not habits. Have succumbed to diseases of despair, depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide.
Because they don't have
Because there isn't
a greater
promise of
purpose, a
something
greater
more. That's the staring into the screaming abyss. If you've got no rope to pull you back,
You say disease of despair?
diseases of despair, and
no hope.
Yeah, and WHO has shared in the last couple of years, more people on this earth kill themselves than die of all wars and natural disasters combined every year.
No way.
So think about our news feeds. All we see is war and natural disasters. Now just disappear that all and just say the silent epidemic is people saying, I cannot make sense of being alive on this earth.
So why be here?
Yeah.
I'm going to die. Yeah.
Yeah, which is one more breaking of our heart. But the thing about heartbreak and actually facing our grief is it categorically makes us stronger and connects us to our courage. And so, like, Tonglen is a Tibetan practice of meditation that's specifically about this, right? And Pema Chodron, who's a Tibetan nun and Buddhist teacher, lays it out. She's like, most meditations, like think happy thoughts, say a mantra, try to get to stillness, try to get to emptiness, something along those lines.
Gratitude.
Yeah, the happy things, right?
Yeah.
Tonglen's the exact opposite. And it's like, start with like actually picturing the picture of the suck. Like literally imagine the black tar, the smoke, the pain, your grief, your angst, your jealousy, your resentment, your neurosis, and then inhale it. Like literally visualize it as tar or smoke, inhale it, and then exhale light, love, compassion. And then when you can do that for yourself, and you actually, this is an imaginal exercise, right? So it works as you cultivate that muscle. It's not some misto thing. It's a thought experiment that you can build those muscles to do better. Then you can expand it to everyone in your family, everyone in your community, and everyone in the world. So you can actually play with that. And then over time, that does something, back to the idea of like steering into the skid, racing cars, right? If you steer away from the skid, you spin out. If you steer into the skid, you have dynamic balance. So you're like, oh, now we take our suffering as raw material for our compassion. And Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple and a bunch of other things, has been a friend and student of Pema Chodron's, and she's got this beautiful line in one of her books. She says, "My heart's been broken open so many times now, it just swings open wide like a suitcase." Right? And that's what I mean about the learn to weep, not whimper.
Learn to feel.
Yes. Learn to feel it all. And Martine...
Don't block it, and don't be whimpering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean Martine Prechtel, who's a powerful man, shaman, poet, teacher from the Mayan tradition. He says, grief is praise, right? It is love's way to honor what it misses.
Ooh.
Right? And our buddy Zach Stein, who's a Harvard-trained psychologist and educational theorist, the number of times I bring this up is obviously has haunted me, right? But he said, we are perhaps entering an era where billions watch while millions die.
This era right now, this time.
Yeah, like this 21st century.
Yeah.
And so you think about that, and televised and live. I mean, think about George Floyd, right? Right. That ricocheted around the world in an asymmetrical way, right? There have been all sorts of events like that all over the place, all the time. Something happened, and it broke our collective brains and hearts. And if you think about even about the languaging, like, I can't breathe. It was so profoundly and vulnerably human. And the rage that it prompted was that. It was the anguish cry of humanity saying, like, no, like, enough is enough. And there's infinite complexities and realities and analysis to unpack around that event, those protests, all those things. But just at that core human level, right? It's profound. And part of that is, it used to just be if something happened, you heard about it through scuttlebutt in your neighborhood or your village. And that was our world. That was the only information we had.
Now it's just like you turn on the phone, every moment you see another tragedy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I read something, probably the most psychoactive thing I've read in the last 6 months was something in the MIT Reader, and it was this wild timeline of humanity's awareness of our own mortality, basically. And it was sort of going all the way back to like the Greeks and ancient Hebrews and all this kind of stuff. And it was saying, look, sure, there were like end of times mythologies always baked in, but that was kind of like literally like lights out, like beam up to the mothership, some complete transformation of reality. But it wasn't until like literally the 1700s, the 1800s, like the discovery of Halley's Comet, and then the fact like, oh my gosh, that's a comet, and then like, wait a second, that could come really close to Earth, and then like, holy shit, are we gonna actually get hit by a comet? And then paleontology, and like, wait, there's dinosaurs and evolutionary theory, and like, we're not the first ones to be here, and these guys aren't here anymore, and what's that about? And like, holy smokes, the idea that humans could go away, and that life in some other form could continue without us.
Crazy.
We've only had this for like wrapped our heads around it briefly for like the last few hundred years. And in fact, speaking of like that Francis Fukuyama book, The End of History and the Last Man, there was the first dystopian science fiction novel was written in 1804 by a French guy called The Last Man. And it was a sci-fi story about a future with the extinction of humanity, and that poor bastard committed suicide.
Oh my gosh!
Right? Oh. So you're like, holy. And now you got Greta Thunberg, right? You have a generation coming up who are like post 2008. They weren't raised with like unicorns and rainbows, and they're like student debt and loans and financial crashes and unemployment and ecological catastrophe, and they're like, you, we're pissed, and how dare you, right? And so this awareness, like there's a sort of sense, it's a little like Neo in the Matrix. You know, it's like, yes, you can learn Kung Fu and you can fly, but ka-chung, ka-chung, you're also in a vat of goo and the machines are coming, right? So let's give you a hug and a high five. Welcome home. Right? You get a weekend to bask in your newfound identity and possibility, and then Monday morning, show up to work. Right? We're needed. We're all needed.
Right. So how do we get back to this place of when we realize all these things are breaking down around us, these beliefs, these ideals, these foundations, what our parents told us was true, whatever it might be, how do we begin to start to understand what our own faith is, what we should believe in, what we should hold on to if there's nothing solid?
Yeah. I mean, the beautiful thing is that the answers are all around us. They really, truly are. Like, in fact, one of my favorite pieces to write in this book was talking about, because basically saying, look, if we're going to rebuild Meaning 3.0, how can we take the best of organized religion and the best of the modern liberal experiment and put them together?
Science, ancient wisdom, everything.
And inclusion and salvation. And is that even possible, right? And so clearly a single tops-down version, contraindicated. We've seen Stalinism, Maoism, fascism, we've seen all the schisms, and they don't work very well. They always end up, basically, whenever the ends of a utopian ideal are heaven on earth or off it, then the means are always justified. So you always end up with bad things happening, right? Because you can always justify it against the ideal. So let's not do that. Let's do decentralized, open source, let 1,000 fires burn, and 900 of them will go out in the storm, but 100 will catch. And then we'll see, and we can pass the light, pass the torches, right? And so one of the simplest things is that dust off all the wisdom traditions. There's thousands of years of accumulated brilliance, insight, and artistry. But even in like the American tradition, and if you take America, because we seem to be kind of, I don't know what we're doing, but we're sort of doing it on behalf of humanity right now, right? Like the grief, the rage, the conflicts, the discussions, everything that is happening here is sort of in some form rippling out through the world or being echoed by similar movements. So race, class, gender, politics, nationality, ecology, all the things, right? And the American tradition has always been this crazy hodgepodge of international experience. You know, you've got Chinese laborers building the railroads, and Irish folks coming in, and West African folks coming in, and Western Europeans, Southern Europeans, all these things, and every, you know, and indigenous folks, and all this, you know, and Spaniards coming up and smashing and crashing into each other, and somewhere in that created like gospel, jazz, blues, folk, right, into, you know, hip hop, into all of these things. This living songbook. And in those songs, those redemption songs, right, it's always the same story, right? It's I've been down so long, right? I'm broke open, and it seems like up to me. Right, that was a 1920s blues song. Drake covered it. Nancy Sinatra and the Doors covered it. Right, you're like that sense of going down the road feeling bad. Right, right, and I'm singing it, and in fact, that becomes a triumphant celebration.
Acknowledging it, talking about it, being aware of it. Yeah,
like Beyonce. I mean, there's the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco has had the Church of Beyonce on Wednesday nights. And they literally get together and they use Beyonce songs as hymns and liturgy, and it is straight the up praise music.
Wow.
Right? It's like Aretha Franklin, like dusted off. And like Beyonce's mom is like Creole, Chinese, African American, French, like all, she's probably got like half a dozen lineages. And she grew up in a Houston Baptist church, and then she's singing this stuff. And like Dolly Parton, like singing like at the Oscars, she was singing this, it was for that movie Trans America, which was all about LGBTQ folks, right? And she was singing the song like, we've all been crucified and they nailed Jesus to a tree, but when I'm born again, you're gonna see a change in me. And you're like, okay, so like you hear it, and like Stanley Crouch at the Lincoln Jazz Center, like the idea that like jazz, blues, all of these traditions are actually this heretical, hermetic, mystic spirituality that is unique to America, because it was all freaks and misfits who came here. And the Protestant church and the Catholic church, they wouldn't have signed off on half the shit that ended up in America as these wild hairball experiments. And we created this defiant liturgy, right? This living hidden scripture in our concerts, in our songbooks, right? In our protests, in our marches, of like, we're here and life hurts and we rise up singing. And you know that, like, you know it's powerful because those are the songs that people hold up lighters for. Those are the like Lady Gaga, right? Like Born This Way. These are the testify songs.
Give you chill songs.
They give you chills, and they give you chills. Like even that Chumbawamba, like way back when, like I get knocked down, but I get up again.
Exactly.
Nothing's gonna keep me down. You got these drunken Scots, right? It's like right. So that you know that like going down into the mud of our shared suffering, and that's back to the weeping, not whimpering, right? And then somewhere in that, feeling the pulse, right? Feeling the beat, like feeling the chorus, and then you're like, oh, we are here. And then it becomes that sort of I am Spartacus moment, right? Where you're like, okay, we are all dead men walking. No one gets out of here alive. Right? So how do we do this? It's the Oh Captain, My Captain and Dead Poets, right? We're gonna get expelled for doing what we're about to do. Our love outweighs our fear.
Wow.
So that sense of like, we all love those moments. We love Leonidas, right? You know, at Thermopylae, we love those calls to arms and courage. Tank Man in Tiananmen Square. Some dude wearing, like, having two like shopping bags in his hands. He wasn't prepped for that shit. He just ends up being like, nah, f this. Stands in front of a phalanx of tanks and says enough is enough.
Crazy.
Good dude got disappeared. We've never heard from him again, and he's never been tracked again.
Really?
And there was like 4 people in matching clothes that came and so either that was good guys, or highly likely it wasn't, right? But that triggered something. And Nancy Keene at Harvard Business School, she wrote we shared a stage at MIT a year ago, and she's a firecracker, and she wrote this amazing book called Forged in Crisis. And it just changed how I think of this stuff. It was Abraham Lincoln, Dietrich von Bonhoeffer, who was the pastor who tried to assassinate Hitler, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, which kicked off the environmental movement, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, and one other. And the thing that was crazy about their stories, including like the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer. And the key was that at the moments that are in Wikipedia, in the moments that we hear about in school, they had no idea what they were doing. Like the Emancipation Proclamation was a Doug Flutie like
Hail Mary
final huck at the buzzer. It was desperate, and he had no idea that it was going to work or become the tide of history. And so you realize but she writes, she's like, when people act from that spot with courage, but with a
desperate courage type
yeah,
of.
a complete, like no certified mail saying this all works out, Sonny, but you got to do it anyway. He says it sends shockwaves through the world, right? So we've talked about all the exponential curves, doing all the exponential things, and how overwhelming that can be, and also fundamentally how scary, right? How much uncertainty, how much fear, how much risk there is in the world as we face it. But the flip side is like nobody promised us a rose garden. Like, have you watched Game of Thrones? I mean, yes, they made that up, but life has been cheap for an awfully long time. Red in tooth and claw and nasty, brutish and short. Has it ever been thus, right? So can we step out of being deconditioned zoo animals? Can we step back into the bigger arc of history? Can we sack the up with courage and access soul force? And that's what Martin Luther King, he said that in that I Have a Dream speech, is when we can rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force, right? And most people, that's how they know it. That was the moment that concept came up on the stage, but he actually had borrowed that twice over. So it wasn't even his words or concepts. It was this fellow, this African-American mystic named Howard Thurman. And he was a mentor to the civil rights movement, but he was so kind of like in his jaw love groove. He didn't actually ever like march with pickets, but he advised all those guys.
Wow.
And all of them carried his books with him, like day to day, like literally, like in their satchels kind of thing. But he went to visit Gandhi in 1935. So he was the first interfaith African-American ambassador to go to India ever.
Wow.
Because you think about this, I mean, 1935 is not that after Reconstruction, right? Like, I mean, you've still got living former slaves. This is
crazy. Fresh
times. And so he goes there and he meets with Gandhi, and Gandhi shares with him this notion of nonviolence, which they called satyagraha. And it was basically means alignment with truth, right? And that is unbreakable.
What is the truth?
Well, but truth, integrity, right action, right? Humanity, dignity, all those things. And so Thurman came home and he's like, okay, satyagraha, that's the Sanskrit, that's a mouthful. No one in this country is going to understand that. I'll tell you what, let's rebrand this. And we'll call it soul force. And because up until then, civil disobedience was just a tactic in the civil rights movement. They're like, let's not get our heads bashed in, and let's not needlessly antagonize folks with guns and batons and dogs.
We stay alive.
And water cannons. That's what it was, right? After that, civil disobedience became the central philosophical pillar of nonviolent protest around the world. And that's soul force, right? And Erica Chenoweth at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, right? She's done this study that's been restated 1,000 times, which is that when she studied from, I think, like 1950 to maybe 2010, I forget quite what her time brackets were, but basically late 20th century into early 21st century civil rights movements that have been successful. That's Eastern Europe, Asia, United States, everywhere else. That it required about 3.5% of the population. That's it. 3.5% of the population to actually make these phase shifts that then can create this catalytic event, which is beautiful and inspiring, right? And that's certainly where Extinction Rebellion and a lot of other social and environmental protest movements have taken inspiration lately. There's also kind of a critique of that, where you're like, hey, it's one thing to be like, I insist on riding in the front of the bus, and the bus has 4 inflated tires and gas in the tank to get to your destination, right? That's one move, right? We're saying, hey, there is this civil experiment. We've been locked or blocked out of it, and we are politely asking for our opportunity to get on board, right? But it's another thing to be like, hey, we are sailing off a cliff in that there bus, and we have to transform it chitty chitty bang bang style into a helicopter before we crash. Like that's kind of where we are, right? So it's like complex intersecting meta crises, and the bus itself of like prosperous, stable civil society is not necessarily persisting. So the Erica Chenoweth's 3.5% is that honking great asterisk of like TBD if this holds up. But the other thing is like we're nowhere near 3.5%.
Right.
So let's get there, and we'll take stock. Right? We'll take stock once we do, and that sense. So you asked about faith, and we've been playing with grief, and we've been talking about courage, right? And our buddy, actually, Andrew Huberman, he's a professor.
Love this guy.
Yeah, right?
Love it.
Rock star and so curious, and then also comes up with ingenious experiments to then validate stuff that you would otherwise just be spitballing about, right? And he told me, it was fascinating, because he told me the story of this research as it was happening. And then last year, he actually finally published it in the journal Nature, which was this story on courage in mice. And they wanted to see what happens basically when we're terrified and what's going on in our brain, right? And everybody has heard of fight or flight, right? But just because it rhymes doesn't mean it's correct. So it's actually, there's flight or freeze, there's that network, and then there's the stand and fight network, which are technically, it's a salience reducing network, meaning like, don't look at me, right? I'm gonna make myself small or get out of dodge. Or a salience enhancing network, which is like, you want a piece of me,
yeah.
right? And
It's like yelling at the bear or something that's coming at you, as opposed to like getting in the fetal position.
Yeah. So, and it all goes through the thalamus in the brain, right? And what they found is when they stimulated this very specific region, right, that it stimulated a salience enhancing response associated with courage. So 98% of mice, when faced with the shadow of a hawk, right, which is what they do in the lab, they just torment these poor mice.
Oh my gosh!
So here comes
shadow.
Here
a
comes
snake.
dinner.
A snake.
Yeah. And then 98% of them piss off and hide under the nearest thing.
They run.
And then only 2% actually thump their tails, but they do it once they're under shelter. So it's kind of a little bit of like a chihuahua move, right? And not very ballsy.
Yeah.
Okay. So then they stimulate the courage center, and then they stand, shut up, thump their tails, and say, "Bring it."
No
so it's like Bruce Lee.
So
they
let
do
me
this.
Bite you.
Yeah. But it gets even better than that, right? So Andrew, being the compassionate dude, he's like, man, am I just pushing their buttons and sending them to their doom? Do they have choice? And so given the choice between food, sex, and having that stimulated, they choose having courage stimulated over food and sex. And humans do too. So like we would rather be brave, we would rather feel brave than get laid.
Why?
Because it is essential. And the final just like amazing, but you can't make this up. The name of that center is called the nucleus reunions. So in Latin, that means the seed of our reunion. It's how we come together. Is our courage. It's poetry. You can't. We couldn't have planned that.
Wow.
But Andrew discovered it.
So we want to feel courage over pleasure.
Over looming threat, right? Like the reason that 300, Harry Potter, Dead Poets, Thelma and Louise, right? Being like, this, we're going to send it. No skid marks. Right? The reason those movies, even Rogue One, you could tell, like I hadn't watched Rogue One yet, and it got really strong reviews, and people were like, okay, this is kind of money. This is a solid addition to the Star Wars franchise. You're like, what's going on here? Like there's a thing here. I don't know what it is, but there was some gravitas to it. And you're like, oh, it's because they die at the end. Right? And in fact, there's a guy, Matthew Polly or Pollard, I think. He was basically like Tim Ferriss before Tim was. So he was at Princeton in the early 90s, and he decided to kind of like game his system, and he had grown up watching Saturday morning kung fu movies, so he was desperate to go and become a Shaolin monk. Wow. So he punched into China long before there were any Westerners, right? So super, super early.
Interesting.
Finds his way to the Shaolin temple, classic thing, in the rain, gets shut out, has to sit on the porch, finally gets invited in, that they adopt him, blah, blah, blah. And then he gets a bunch of VHS tapes shipped over with Rambo and Schwarzenegger movies. So it's like they're the rickety old TV, plug in the VHS, and he's like, I'm going to show you our hero movies. And they watch them all night on Saturday night, binge watch them. And then he finishes like, so what'd you think? And they looked at him with funny faces, and they're like, well, Matthew, man, what's the deal? He goes, I thought you said these were your hero movies. And he's like, yeah, these are action heroes. They're absolutely amazing. He's like, no, they all
live.
They all live.
No one dies.
No one dies for the cause.
Ooh.
In all of our hero stories, right?
And
they have to die.
Really?
Yes. Right? And so that notion of consumerism and rational individualism and all of the isms and the stories and the specifics of 20th century, 21st century Western culture have been, you can have your cake and eat it. You don't have to make trade-offs.
The fairy tale ending.
You do deserve your best life. There is no ambiguity or complexity to this thing, and it's happily ever after always for everyone, or at least for the good guys. Right? Versus the notion, and my friend and business partner, Kurt Cronin, is a former Deb Group commander, said a modern version of this. He said whenever they were going downrange into combat, they planned to come home in a body bag.
Shut up.
Well, of course, right? It's not surprising. And but he said, I had written my letters.
Oh my gosh.
I had established my will. I had figured out my trust for my children so that they were good through 21 or through their marriages. Like I had it all done.
Prepared for the worst.
And he never lost a man.
So that I could go out there fully. Yeah. Wow.
So it's the samurai notion of meditate on 1,000 ways to die so that you're not distracted on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Right? And so that notion, we are terrified of death. Right? We punch ourselves full of plastic surgery, dyes and fillers, right? To the point of creating caricatures of youth and beauty in ways that you just, that are heartbreaking. You're like, gosh, just allow yourself to be an elder. Allow yourself to have the dignity and the appreciation and the respect. We ship our grandparents off to nursing homes to be cared for by anonymous hourly wage workers and pumped full of drugs so they don't make a fuss. We are obsessed with youth and beauty and all of the things, but don't acquaint ourselves with our mortality, and it's that contrast that actually gives us back our dignity. It's sort of like our humanity feels like it's at the intersection of our mortality and our divinity.
Say it again.
Our humanity lies at the intersection of our mortality and our divinity. And when we can balance those two dialectics, right, then we have a chance to be, what you could sort of call a homegrown human. Like, I'm no longer trying to get off this ride. I'm no longer trying to transcend it. I'm not looking for my next sound bath or cacao ceremony or medicine ceremony. I'm not hop-bopping around to catch the next big thing, nor am I collapsed in despair. It's much more like Jimmy Stewart in A Wonderful Life, right? It's that moment of like, oh, holy, I am blessed with the opportunity to live out the rest of my precious life with full agency, balls deep, completely committed and fearless. And to your point about faith, right? We haven't touched on the notions of healing trauma, peak state cultivation access, the kind of things that we have been playfully calling the alchemist's cookbook, right? But the TLDR of it is that we have access to more transformative technologies than we have ever had in human history.
Therapeutic modalities, experiences.
Yes. And it can be high-tech and expensive, like sensory deprivation tanks and transcranial magnetic stimulation and brainwave stimulations and all these things. They can be middling, like the new trials at Imperial College and Johns Hopkins and NYU and elsewhere with psychedelic therapies. They can be super low-tech, like breath work or trance, trance EDM music, all the way to at home with a special friend and psychosexual practices. Right. So there's a whole kind of stack and access and pick time, money, effort, complexity, and you too can blow yourself sky high. And the protocol is actually consistent. And in fact, Carl Diceroth at Stanford, one of Andrew's colleagues, has been the godfather of optogenetics, so the ability to kind of stimulate light in brains and turn on different genes and that kind of stuff.
That's not EMDR stuff, is it?
No, but EMDR, funnily enough, if you put a pin in that, because I'd be happy to come back to this as part of this integrated theory of like peak states and trauma relief.
Got it.
Right? So what they found was that they used epileptic patients who normally have such seizures and tremors, and gave them ketamine. Right, so a dissociative anesthetic that also promotes, depending, very interesting to totally otherworldly interior experiences. Sort of dissociative, like I have an out-of-body experience. It's used in battlefield as an anesthetic, and it's also lately been starting to get used in psychotherapy.
Got it.
More broadly. It had been underground for a while. And what they found was that experience of dissociation there were two things. Subjectively, it helped as an antidepressant. So stepping out of myself for a moment, right, allow me to come back into myself with a little bit more equanimity.
Bird's eye view, having awareness
it was
of the situation.
I got to unzip the monkey suit.
You're not in it, you're out of the situation, looking in, reflecting.
Yeah, and then really interestingly, they're like, oh, and what's going on when someone is under the influence of ketamine and self-reporting that they're having an out-of-body experience that also then is alleviating depression. 3 hertz neuroelectric brainwave. Like, fascinating. Okay, so now we got a signature that's going on. And by the way, that also happens with 5-MeO-DMT and a whole host of other psychedelics, even if they are actually interacting with different neural pathways and systems, right? So psilocybin, LSD, other things, Prozac are all in the serotonergic system. Ketamine is not, and does things differently. It's not a tryptamine-based thing, but they're all doing this delta wave activity. But then they reverse engineered it, and this is the interesting part. They reverse engineered it and said, okay, now no drugs, but we're just going to electrically stimulate your brain back to 3 hertz. Now what happens? And same dissociative experience and same positive impact. So you're like, okay, so we used a compound to be able to reliably get the conditions we want to study.
We don't need the drugs.
Now we don't need the drugs. And the same thing happens with specific advanced meditative techniques and breathwork techniques can get you into delta waves and different compounds. So nitrous oxide, there was a study with a kinesiologist at MIT, and they found that nitrous oxide will put you into delta wave states for 3 to 12 minutes. So not indefinitely, like if you're breathing it for a dental surgery, you're doing something over a long time, 3 to 12 minutes is all you get. But in that time, you get double the amplitude of when you're asleep. Because normally the only time, like delta waves are a little bit like the redheaded stepchild in the EEG world, right? Because people are interested in beta, because that's where we do our talking. And if folks are listening to us, unless they're like multitasking, they're probably in beta if they're trying to follow this.
It's that's beta, and then there's delta, beta. And then there's theta, right?
Yeah, except that it kind of goes the other way if we're dealing with hertz. So basically, beta is the most fast that we typically have access to. Above that consistently is gamma, and that's like the occasional like flash bulb, eureka kind of moment. Tends not to be unless you're like a super disciplined meditator, something you hang in. It's usually like a gestalt integrative flash. But below beta, which is our waking state normal, comes alpha, and that's starting to get into more relaxed, more contemplative, a little bit more spacious, a little bit more kind of zen, and then below, and potentially flow states, and then into theta, which is people often power down and get sleepy in it, actually. Like, unless you're trained and you know that feeling is something to power through, most people are like, oh, I'm not up here neurotic hamster wheel, so I'm just going to power down now, right? But it's actually even more expansive. It's typically like the hypnagogic state, like when you're lying in bed and you don't think you're drifting off to sleep, but you actually have, and you get like jimmy leg, or you like elbow your partner or something like that, right? Or you have some whack-ass dream where you're like, wait, whoa, I guess I'm dreaming. Like, that's right around theta. Below that, and barely into consciousness, is delta. And typically we don't have access to that while awake, right? So waking EEG researchers, consciousness researchers tend not to spend a lot of time there. And then sleep researchers are almost always focused on REM and dreaming. And delta is deep dreamless sleep. But what happens is it correlates with a brainstem level reset. And what we're seeing is that it also, when you're in it, that is as close to being dead, right, as possible. It's like backdoor lucid dreaming.
Yes.
But it is not without content. So if you can be conscious while in delta, you sort of have access to the cheat codes of the cosmic browser. And this is consistent reporting, right, across experiences. Like Winston Churchill was one of the first patients to get exposed to nitrous oxide. And he said, world upon world of almost alien information reveals itself. And he goes, but it slips through your fingers, and I've come to regard it really as mere substitution of mental pain for physical pain. In the sense of like, oh my gosh, I've just seen the light, but I can't remember.
Oh man.
Right? So you're like, so this is fascinating. And you realize that all of those compounds plus neuroelectric stimulation to the cranial nerves, right, and to our brainstem, do that. They do a systemic reboot of the brainstem, which accompanies delta wave activity, which tends to subjectively yield equanimity, out-of-body experience, and access to insane amounts of highly salient or relevant or interesting information.
And when we get into those states, we get out of suffering states. Is that what I'm hearing you say? We're getting out of pain and this, what's happening in the moment.
Yeah, you're long gone from that. And you're basically, like I said, it's basic. You know how that they have that vomit comet, that plane that you pack and all the windows blocked
I
up?
can't do it.
And it does the roller coaster arc through the sky.
Can't do it.
And for that part, right, everybody's in 0G.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
So for 3 to 12 minutes, you can find yourself in 0G hyperspace, where you can think anything you want about anything you can think of with a 300 IQ and the only game, the name of the game is you can't fumble the football in the end zone. So that's one step. So we have delta wave, neuroelectric, and basically what we're doing here is we're telling the cheat codes to a do-it-yourself death, rebirth, initiation, peak state that discharges trauma and allows you to establish somatic experiential faith that it all works out. so just didn't want to bury the lead or let anyone think that we're gathering wool. So we have pay attention to the things that allow you to do brainstem resets, and that can be transcranial magnetic stimulation, that can be electrical stimulation through the tongue. There's an FDA phase 3 clinical trials on a POMS device that I've actually tried. I tried it downhill mountain biking in Whistler and rode it down the track. So put it in, crank the juice, and it's because all the headsets, like the biohacking headsets, don't really work because your skull's really thick and 9-volt batteries aren't very strong.
So you got to get into the tongue, so it's connected.
So the tongue goes into I think it's 10 cranial nerves, and it goes straight into the brainstem. So there's the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then the other, and the vagal nerve is also there.
Wow.
So
you wore this thing that was a shock to your tongue.
Yes.
And is it shocking every second on the way down?
And funnily enough, I mean, well, this is a fascinating tale, and if people can hold the branches in this conversation, we'll take this quick one. So the reason this device came to be is Paul Baccarita at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the father of sensory substitution. So if you know David Eagleman's work at Stanford, right, and the sensory vest and all that kind of stuff, David is very much coming out of Paul Baccarita's lineage.
Okay.
But the SEALs they were doing night dives, combat night dives, no visibility. And it sucks because you can't see what you're doing. And B, spatially disorienting. Right. You're literally, it's like just being in a
trying
void.
to touch everything,
Yeah, so imagine those 5-day darkness meditation retreats, but in a sensory deprivation tank, right? It's a crazy town. And 8 hours at a time, right? So they would sneak in and then post up and then wait, all this kind of stuff. So they're like, okay, can we do the same techniques that blind folks are using, like tapping with a cane and learning to see through field?
Yeah.
Can we do with electrical stimulation with this paddle on our tongue? So if it buzzes on the left, I swim left. If it buzzes on the right, if it's on my on the tip of my tongue, I swim down. If it's on the back of my tongue, I swim up. So can we basically joystick our frogmen?
Someone else joysticking
in a Zodiac boat,
watching you, and then guiding you. Wow.
And again, what our buddy from DevGroup was just saying, he's like, you get under a big ship and it goes haywire. So they swim on these paddles, they've got their compasses, the metal starts spinning, you can't have lights. You
have no idea where you're going.
There's prop wash, there's noise, it's a shit show. So they took these paddles and started learning to steer their swimmers. And then they realized something, which is that when they came out from super long, like 6-hour, 8-hour submersions in zero visibility situations, a lot of folks had basically like spatial vertigo or the bends, right? But the guys who'd been running the paddles didn't. And so they're like, that's funny, why is that? And the electrical stimulation into the brainstem was actually serving as a global system reboot and a calibration. So it was enhancing neuroplasticity and improving vestibular training and action, which is back to the downhill mountain biking bit,
Sure.
right? So you can actually create peak performance situations by conducting neuromotor pattern repetition, right, while experiencing brainstem resets. And then they've now taken this to phase 3 clinical trials.
Wow.
And it's used for cerebral palsy, it's used for TBI, it's used for MS, and it's also being used for peak performance. So that's just another example of, okay, so now we're hot on the trail. We're like delta waves rock and seem to be the signature of heightened access to the information layer. Enhanced pattern recognition, cogitation, inspiration, information, right? So we're pinning that. Brainstem reset, and then, oh, by the way, the vagal nerve starts here. It goes all the way through our bodies, modulates our heart, our lungs, our digestion, our immune response, and goes all the way through our root. Right, so even like Anish Seth, who's a Princeton gastroenterologist, called it poophoria. Like if you've ever had an especially large bowel movement and somehow felt sweaty or palpitations or goosebumps or even really, really good, right? He says to some it feels like an orgasm, to some like a religious experience, and to a lucky few like both. Well, really all that is moving the male, and that's putting pressure against your vagal nerve, which is actually stimulating your entire spinal column.
Wow.
So you're like, oh, okay, so we're just worms with like chop off our legs and arms, right? And the circuitry of how we work is our spinal columns and our vagal nerves. So you're like, okay, so now we realize delta waves, brainstem reset, vagal nerve optimization, increased nitric oxide in your system, and that can be everything from eating beets and what are those little seeds? Yes, beets, greens, or even supplements like Neo40 that are concentrates, or even ED drugs, right? Viagra boosts nitric oxide. Right, and not only does it, and that it's a vasodilator, which is why Viagra used it. But actually, what nitric oxide does is it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it allows for the transport of stress chemicals and optimal, psychologically enhancing neurochemicals. So Herbert Benson at Harvard called it the Bliss Molecule, and it's actually the precursor to flow states and peak states. So you're like, okay, so vasodilation is generally healthy and happy. And by the way, it's actually an anti-COVID, it's an antiviral.
That's what I heard from James Nestor.
Yeah.
He's talking about this and breathing through the nose, and how the virus can't survive in this, right?
Yeah, so high nitrogen, basically the more, I mean, I wouldn't say the more the merrier, period, but in general, we are under, and boosting can enhance. Right. So you do these things, and then you also realize, and then engage in spinal and pelvic mobility, right? And the issues are in our tissues. So if you engage in it, and this gets to your EMDR point, right? There's kind of a progression where you can be like, okay, there's neuro tremor release. Have you seen that stuff? Where people do like an isometric hold, like a wall sit or a leg lift, and they wait until their muscles fatigue, and then they start moving, and then they start oscillating. And there's actually like 3 different levels of frequency. And first it's disorganized. I think they call it brown waveforms. I don't quite understand their color coding, but I think that's how they do it. And that's just spazzing. And most people are so uncomfortable and so self-conscious they won't let it happen, right? But if you are with a therapist and you understand the jam, you start doing that, and then it actually settles down and it starts getting organized. And it's literally as if it's your nervous system defragging and rewiring up healthy movement patterns. Right? It's the whole Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, which he had that book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, right? Like animals don't stress, right? Because they discharge. And we had just done an expedition on the north face of Everest in Tibet. We came back to Thailand. We went to the islands. We put all of our students on a plane in Bangkok and then took a honeymoon on the islands in Thailand. This is long before before the beach came out, I think. So it was like super chill. And we were climbing this wild volcano grotto in the jungle at like sunset, and it was super sketchy. Like we see this German couple come down all covered in mud, wild-eyed, like what the hell? We're like, no, we're gonna go do this. This looks fun. And then we get to this super crazy slick limestone slab, and there's this monkey stuck, right? And he's freaking out, and it's too slippery, and he doesn't know what he's gonna do, and he's like, and we're like, oh my God, we can't help him. He's too far out there, but like, what's gonna happen? And then finally he kind of like gets it together, and he just lunges and does this dino, and like does this one-handed thing, grabs the top, pulls himself up, looks around, frantically beats off, and then just off into the jungle, never to be heard from again. And you're like, genius.
Wow.
Right? So that notion of, now that's a funny story.
Was that, so he was stressed for a second, but then releases it.
Yes, through, right? Cultivating and then discharging energy through his nervous system.
Interesting.
And you're like, okay, so this is how all animals forever have done it. We're walking around stressed,
holding on to it,
totally anchored in the past, whether that's I got a blown shoulder or a bum knee or a bad back, and I sit in the same chair the same way all day, and it's accumulating trauma, or it's just micro PTSD, and I'm just this fibrillating, disorganized mess. And then you realize, back to brainstems, delta waves, can I reboot my nervous system? Establish a global systemic reset. And can I do that by pulsing energy, loading and pulsing energy through my nervous system such that it discharges me and lets me, just like a laptop that's fritzing, cold reboot, power back up,
and be fresh again.
Homeostasis. Yeah. Now, life is life, and I'm going to still face every challenge and opportunity to get knocked off that. But if I can come back to center via means and tools that I have access to that don't cost an arm and a leg, can I come from my best more often? And can I metabolize my grief as fast as I'm taking it in?
So not holding on to it for months and years and suffering, experiencing it, having your heart open, allowing yourself to feel, and then moving on.
Yeah, and then so now throw in vocal. So now let's do that, tremor release. So let's say I'm lying on my back with a high bridge, I've got my ass off the ground and my thighs are vibrating, right? And they start flopping around and I start doing this stuff. And potentially I start doing what James Nestor talked about. That was the Karolinska Institute study, right? Which was vibrating humming through my nasal cavity. So now, so now I'm making sounds and I'm generating increased nitric oxide. Now you talked about EMDR and tapping. All of these things, funnily enough, it's not that this is a new age grab bag. It's not. You have a bunch of intuitives that stumble onto a function that works. They may or may not know why it works. And then they package it, productize it, put a name on it, put a brand on it, have an economic driver and incentives
built
around
a cult around it.
And it shits the bed. But you're like, oh, what's the mechanism of action underneath all this stuff? If we can get to that, then we can engage in culture architecture cleanly, and we can just share people with the source codes. Here's the Lego.
What is the source code?
Well, these are the source codes, right? Which is cultivating and discharging energy through your nervous system in both allowing chaotic discharge and then enhancing reorganization. So throw in EMDR, like eyes, tongues, movement, and just go through the motions. Imagine if some space anthropologist came down and was like, okay, humans, here's the user manual. You guys are just figure this out almightily, here's how. And giving us the capacity to do this skillfully, right? Throw in EMDR is what? That's the eye movement one. Then there's EFT, I guess, is emotional something, or maybe there's
Is that tapping essentially?
Emotional freedom technique. So once these get brands and acronyms, they're stuffed, right? Because they cease to innovate and they cease to be curious about evidence. But if you're like, hey, there might be a there.
Right. And then there's Wim Hof method, and then there's breathing, and there's cold therapy.
And how do we separate placebo? Right, and selection bias from is there a legit there? And once you put those things together, now you can add in like theraguns.
Yep.
Right, you're like, oh, so now let's take isometric tremor, and now let's increase percussive vibration. Let's do soft tissues. I mean, how many people actually touch their abdomen, for God's sake? I mean, how much shame, how much
there's so much shame and trauma.
And like even just having partners, right? And then engage in like acro yoga and Thai massage, like actually connecting with another human and applying traction on our joints and opening up the space in our joint capsules and stretching soft tissues and sliding surfaces and full range of motion in our pelvis and spine. Like these things aren't simply disconnected physical movement sequences. They actually show up in our consciousness register. They actually shape and inform our experience. And so like the absolute money there is, and all of this is 50% of it, because then you can also add in conscious sexuality on top of that, right? And then you end up in basically a sexual yoga. So the end-to-end spectrum, if you take it without apology, is to say psychedelic sex, time-traveling psychedelic sex magic, or a hedonic engineering, right? Because the next movement is special calisthenics, basically, like where you basically have a physician that is 3 C's. So you know Dan Savage, right? The sex advice guy.
Yeah.
So he always talks about good, giving, and game, the 3 G's, right? For a partner.
Sure.
Right? So the 3 C's for your doctor is courageous, curious, and connected. So they need to be willing to engage in full spectrum health for patients. They need to be connected to the research in the psychedelic therapeutic space and compounding pharmacies. And they need to be curious about what modalities are potentially functional, because hands down, the next wave of psychedelic therapies is going to be special K calisthenics, which is threshold dose ketamine with body work. And you can get in a month of yoga or physical therapy in an hour. And it's completely integrated psychosomatic. So you're like, what I mean by saying it's psychosomatic, normally people just, when they say that word, they mean, oh, it's all in your head, you made it up. And that's a pejorative of the term, but psychosomatic just means body and brain together. So when you shift and move your tissues, right, you end up having it's almost as if it's like the monitor of your self system is in your mind, and you're like, oh, okay, that was that phone call on Tuesday, or that was that ski wreck, or that was, and it discloses itself as it leaves your system.
It's kind of like the body keeps the score mentality. Or
issues are in the tissues, body keeps the score, et cetera. And if you look at Bessel van der Kolk's work, I mean, bless his heart, right? But most of the suggestions he's recommending for the physicality is really straightforward.
Yeah.
It's like, do yoga, that's good.
Right.
Like, do you know, like
move
something
your body,
so you're like,
stretch,
okay, so great, exactly.
eat healthy food.
So put in special calisthenics, right, with a K, right? Put in Theragun use, and then for those of you playing along at home with a special friend, so there's basically like 3 levels. There's solo practices, partner practices and couple practices, right? That's it. And any of these work, you can just do breath work, you can just do body work, you could just do music and dance, you could just do substances, right? In responsible sacramental or therapeutic use. And you could just do sexuality. If you combine them all, right, you end up with
this cocktail of...
Well, I mean, you end up with the notion of like stacking. So rather than using one atom bomb, you actually have a bunch of different modalities that gives you trim tabs and steer. So you're less likely to get into super duper trouble. It's much easier to back off, and it's also it's a little bit more self-directed. So if you said, hey, I'm going to lock you in a 10-day Vipassana retreat, good luck. It could be awesome for you.
Right.
Many people report profound experiences, but it could also be super intense and hairball, or really uncomfortable or scary. You would want more support. Someone could say, well, you're going to go to Peru and go on an ayahuasca journey. And 12 hours later, like hair on fire, like what on earth just happened? My world and the reality just unraveled. But if you combine things, you can, well, there's actually, and for both of those, I'll even throw in one more. You could maybe, we lived up in the mountains in Colorado, ran mountain bike, the Leadville 100, those kind of ultra marathon races. And they're actually profound. Like the amount of community and support, and people get cracked open after running for 14 hours straight through the night and all these kind of things. So you're like, okay, maybe I go for the runner's high to end all runner's high. But you're like, that was a 100-mile race. My body is healing for 3 months, right? The same thing with long psychedelic experiences, which is why, by the way, psilocybin is in all the studies, not LSD. It's not because psilocybin is better, it's because it lasts 6 to 8 hours. And LSD will last 8 to 12 hours, and a hospital shift is 8 hours. So they picked a substance that fits within professional work, which makes sense. I mean, God bless them. You don't have to be like trip sitting somebody for a day and a half. But the idea of long arc experiences is that there's typically there's a fixed period of time at the peak that's really useful. Right? That's like day 6 and 7 in a Vipassana retreat. That's miles 70 to 90 on an ultra run. That's hours 5 and 6 on an LSD trip.
It's not the beginning half. It's not the very last part.
So you get these shoulders, right?
Yeah.
And the shoulders is body load, confusion, fatigue, random other shit punching into your experience at that time. So you're like, okay. And not to mention just practical. Very few people just have days to write off their calendar.
Right.
So, but everything from cost to access to calendar to intensity to propensity for vulnerability or exposure in those transitional phases. You're like, okay, now let's do the other thing. Let's go, instead of for wavelength, like this big long event, go for amplitude. Stack stuff, get up as high as possible into the information that's useful, right? And come back down in a way that you can integrate. So like get what's yours, remember it, don't be exhausted, don't be wrung out, don't need a week to come back to normal.
Recover,
right? Recover. And you can see the opposite side is also true. If you take an experience like DMT or 5-MeO DMT, right? Some of these, notorious and super trendy, high octane psychedelics that are like 15-minute rocket rides, right? Too much, too fast, too soon. And people, they rave about them, but for their therapeutic insights, they are, I think, remarkably lacking. Because once you are simply white light God consciousness, or you're unleashed into the galactic
pure
carnival,
love,
you're like, now what do I do with that?
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't necessarily help or give. It's so deep, it's so impersonal, and so depersonalizing that it disconnects me from showing up with more heart, more connectedness,
compassion toward
more engagement.
What are your thoughts on all these medicines and psychedelics and drugs to help us heal, or therapy drugs, I guess, that people are doing now? Do you think it's beneficial to do, or do you feel like it's a never-ending necessity to feel peace, to feel whole, centered, grounded?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and there's several different ways to kind of come at it.
Because I've never personally done any of it. I've never been high or drunk in my life. And I just don't have a desire to. Like, I have lots of friends that do it and swear by it, says it's amazing, the experiences, the things you learn, the things you see, the things you heal. I'm like, that's cool. I just don't have like a calling to want to try to put my brain in that space. I feel like there's other meditative practice that I've done that I also feel a lot of peace and out-of-body experiences and like, I'm floating in space type of mentality. So for me, I haven't, who knows what's actually happening when you're on these drugs, but I know that I can do other things as well without it. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that, my position is usually not having a specific dog in most of those fights. It's kind of what's a level up from that. What's the mechanisms of action, and what do they do that's helpful?
Right.
And once we understand that, then
just do that.
Well, then we can come at it through whatever method or mode is appropriate for us. So, arguably, one of the biggest benefits of state shifting techniques or practices broadly, whichever ones you wanted to choose, is that they let us shift our state, and that having a range of our neurophysiology, right, and our psychology is generally healthy. So rather than being stuck on one channel, what's called like monophasic, like every day I wake up, it's the same me in the same head doing the same things, thinking the same thoughts, telling the same stories, right? Being able to change the channel. And indigenous societies always did that. They had dreams, premonitions, possessions, trance, a whole range of consciousness they considered valid. Not just, that's just repressions from your sexual frustrations and your unconscious, forget it, that's drivel, or you need to be medicated, or, there was a full range that was accepted and embraced as legit means of making sense of things. We went to Descartes, cogito ergo sum, empiricism 101. If it's not measurable, it doesn't exist. And we got our dial stuck, right? And so we're really one of the only societies ever that's been a monophasic or single channel culture. And that creates lots of stress, dis-ease, all those things. When we expand that range, we gain back health and resilience. We discharge, we gain more information, more perspectives. And I think you can make a case that part of the rise in everything from Spartan training and CrossFit to Wim Hof and contrast therapy, ice bathing, saunas, right? Breath work, all of these things, we're like, holy shit, intermittent fasting. All of it is in some way a high-tech, sometimes consumerized attempt to be like, hey, what is it like to be a hunter-gatherer who slept cold, who ran long, who went hungry, who feasted big, who did all of these things, who suffered, who didn't have climate control, didn't have a pantry filled with overstuffed calories at the whim with salty, sweet, and fat programmed in to make me keep coming back. Like all that stuff. We're trying to break out of that and recreate the conditions that we know create vitality and let us thrive and are just richer and more novel and more alive for us. So in that respect, I think that the ability to shift state is really valuable. And the use of some form of psychoactive plants or compounds is not just perennial through human history. And our buddy Brian Marurescu just recently came out with that book, The Immortality Key, where he's made a case of through ancient Greece into early Christianity, that there was potentially some continuity there. That's one very specific and scholarly kind of take at a time period in a specific geography. Fascinating. But Ron Siegel at UCLA has talked about the desire to shift consciousness is not even specific to humans and across time, across time and culture, but also specific to, like across the animal kingdom. Not just primates, all mammals, birds. The idea of creating lateralization, increased pattern recognition, and the seeking out of novel information has apparently outweighed being lit and falling out of your tree. Yeah. Right? There's been an evolutionary adaptive advantage to changing the channel from time to time.
Yes.
So where we are right now is utterly unprecedented. We've been stuck in this monophasic culture. Everybody's yearning to change the channel. People are piling into psychedelics and anything they can get their mitts on. And this is the first, so they have open access to all psychotechnologies from around the world today to your door, right? And at the same time, ripped out of cultural context. So the idea is, basically,
led by someone who probably doesn't know what they're doing.
Hucksters and charlatans, and some really well-meaning folks too.
Sure.
But they're getting increasingly swamped by the sociopaths and the connies who are coming into the space because there's so much there. And so the idea is it's like breaking the sticks off bottle rockets and still hoping they'll go where you point them. And really they're just going to blow up all over the place, which we are seeing because there's actually there's a group, the mountain Ak people of Papua New Guinea. And I remember reading this anthropology study. It was from a guy, an Oxford anthropologist named Richard Rudgley. And it was basically, they had, let's think, how many stages were there? 12. There were 12 stages of plant initiation in their society. And the first 3 were for ginger, And then the middle 6, is that right? Yeah, the middle 6 were for tobacco, different forms of tobaccos. And then the final 3 were for different strains of psychedelic mushrooms. But not like the ones that folks are used to today, like gnarly ones, toxic ones, like ones that kill you if you don't do them properly. And it was kind of like a Montessori classroom. In a Montessori classroom, a young kid is allowed to come in and they're allowed to work with any material in this beautifully arranged classroom, provided they've already been shown by the guide how to do it properly. And then, so you freedom within limits, and you're not allowed to do something you haven't been introduced to or something that's you're not yet ready for. And the same thing for the Mountain Ock people. So once you were initiated into a level, then you had open access for your own discretionary use because you'd been shown how to do it properly. But you weren't allowed, right, to skip levels, right, or poach.
Right.
And it was kind of a selected pyramid. It was fewer and fewer people got invited into the subsequent stages.
It's kind of like getting your black belt.
Yes.
It's like you've got to go through all these different stages first. Yeah.
And the fascinating thing is that the final 2 stages, that was only for initiation into elders, right? And once they had their visions, then what they saw was then included into the living scripture. So rather than being like, here's the Bible, signed, sealed, delivers, every word is unquestionably, inviolably true, period, end of story. Anything you have to say is heresy, and we're going to burn you at the stake if you try. They're like, oh, no, add that. There's another page. Add that. There's another page. So you're like, oh, that's neat. That's like this open source living tradition, freedom within limits, and structure. So if we take psychedelics today, or let's just say psychedelic renaissance, psychedelic therapy, since that's where most of the media conversation is, you can do a bell curve, and you can be like, hey, 10% of the population should probably never try them. And that's people with family histories of mental illness, existing diagnoses, and if you could screen for this up front, dark triad personalities, psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians. And because you don't want them to be better at who they are.
Right. They don't want these powers, yeah.
No, you really don't. You don't want to be training Sith Lords by accident, right? And the idea that psychedelics only and always create love and kindness and expansion is actually simply not the case. And in fact, golly, I'm going to forget his name now. Sidney Gottlieb, I think it is, who was the founder of MK Ultra, the super gnarly government dark ops project, right? That shows up in Stranger Things and that kind of stuff. He dropped acid 200 times and was an utterly amoral son of a bitch, and actually dosed Whitey Bulger, the mafia boss who was up in Boston in prison. Like he was one of his subjects.
Wow.
Whitey was still Whitey, right? So to say nothing of Aztec sacrifices and Yanomamo drinking ayahuasca and still spearing each other, humans are humans.
Sure.
And we're complex, and adding more just makes us more. It doesn't always make us groovier. So 10% should probably never try it. 80% of the middle of the bell curve should probably only have like 3 cultured initiatory experiences through their life. And then only 10% should be sort of test pilots or psychonauts, going back to the wishing well more than that. And if you think about, so let's talk about the 80. Like what would a roadmap possibly look like if we said, oh, we've ripped this out of culture and context. That's probably not a great thing. What are examples around the world, like the Mountain Ock people, like of hundreds of traditions around the world of responsible intergenerational use? How can we learn? This is the culture architecture part. Like, how can we build things that are missing, right? That might serve us and others going down the road. So you're like, okay, well, for sure, adolescence, marriage, and death. Those are major, major rites of passage, and we tend to f them up all night.
Right.
So you're like, okay, and let's draw and learn from the evidence-based, ethically committed practices that are happening at Imperial, Hopkins, and elsewhere. So you're like, okay, so Hopkins has kind of found that Goldilocks dosage of psilocybin is 3 grams. That's enough to create an experience of the numinous, of ineffability, of awe, of connection, of all these healthy things. And it tends not to be so much that it wigs folks out. Right? It's a couple of clicks back from Terence McKenna's like 5 grams silent darkness.
And it's not addictive either, right?
No, not at all. So the idea is like, what if you had a truly grounded initiatory rite of passage for a 16-year-old, for an 18-year-old, for something in that space, and awakening who I am on this earth in community, and then now welcome and now start showing up that way.
Interesting.
Right, and of course, some folks may say that's so wildly irresponsible, drugging kids, Bob. And you're like, well, no, we are already drugging kids. We're putting them on amphetamines, we're putting them on antipsychotics, we're doing all sorts of things to them already, turning a blind eye. And initiatory practices like this are as old as humanity. So let's decouple and take an anthropological look at this and say what's missing. And then what happens to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, I don't fit, what's the point, what's the purpose? Could we address that openly? Take marriage, right? I mean, these days it's status displays and virtue signaling, but it's not an initiation into like Hyros Gamos, like sacred union.
Right.
It's caterers and Instagram shots and photographers and gift registries at Williams and Sonoma. It's like, and people and the couple on the other end, they've been sleeping together and cohabitating for the most part before, so it's not even wedding night, bells and magic. Like all of it's gone.
Right.
And you're like, okay, what if with the wedding party, with the selected minister or officiant, with closest friends, whatever it would be that was appropriate, to do the MAPS therapeutic dosage of MDMA. So, and again, not for the substance, right? This is the fact that vasopressin, oxytocin, prolactin come online, and some serotonin as well, right? I feel safe, I feel secure, I feel connected to my heart, and I am able to give voice to deeper truths and deeper wounds and fears than I might normally be able to. And what if we shared our vows from that space and anchored it? And then if once a year or once a decade, cadence, take your pick, but if once on our anniversary, we came back, we go to a cabin, we go camping, we do whatever we do, and we reconnect. And I mean, there's thousands of couples already doing this improvisationally, but and we reconnected and we revisited those vows. And we were able to express our frustrations, our sadness, our tiredness, our bitterness, our resentments, our pain, and our love and our hope and our dreams. And we could do that in a way, because I mean, I guess I'm just in the season of life for this, but I mean, I have had half a dozen dear friends in the last 3 to 4 years, all blow-up relationships, and with children, so there's skin in the game. And it's almost consistently been because one partner has trauma, unable or unwilling to process it. And in these instances, these were faultless tragedies. Like this wasn't someone had
cheated or
there was no cheating, there was no infidelity, there was no addiction, there was no in fact there was the opposite of financial stresses, and they blew apart anyway. And it was just the accretion of grief, resentment, and frustration, and the inability to go back
and heal the trauma of the past.
Yes, and get it. So you're like, so when you throw kids in the mix, you're like, oh, we've got some skin in this game. And in fact, Brian Evanescu, I think that's his name. Brian Earp, I think, and Julian Evanescu. They wrote a book called Love Drugs. One's an ethicist at Oxford and one's an ethicist at Yale. And they've basically just said, hey, look, folks, family counseling, couples therapy, I've never seen it work personally, but I mean, all power if you can find a good person that can help you. But hey, at this point, the era of supplementing relational therapeutic support with pharmacology has arrived, and it's now unconscionable not to. And because the question is, again, like the idea, crypto-puritanism, whether it's what are you doing giving substances to adolescents, that's unethical. In fact, back in the 50s at UCLA, they were dosing 3 to 12-year-olds with LSD. Like in the schizophrenia wards. And this wasn't wild. This was a Sandoz pharmaceutical substance. It had promising results, and their results were off the charts. They were having profound responses. Rick Domlin really shifted my thinking on this. He's like, look, we know what we know now about the efficacy of healing trauma, right? If you've got an 18-year-old who's had adverse childhood events and is suffering from PTSD, and you know what 3 sessions with a therapist with this compound could do for them, and you're going to say no and say, go ahead and suffer. You may kill yourself. You may do any sorts of things for the next 3 years until you click over. At what point is standard of care an obligation to treat? Right?
Interesting.
Does it kick us into engaging these things? So the notion of like, oh, chemsex is cheating. That's debauched, right? That's the stuff I read about in Vice magazine. Right? Like that's not romantic. How could I? And that's what the case they're making in Love Drugs is like, look, we're already doing chemsex. We're just doing it really badly.
Right.
Like everybody gets plied with alcohol, right? Alcohol is a massive dehydration. It dehydrates and desensitizes. It dulls a woman's orgasm. And like Dr. Ruth, right, the OG sex therapist said, and it hangs right off the end of a man's penis, right? So alcohol sucks and is the ubiquitous substance of choice. hormonal birth control completely wrecks sexual response and attractiveness. So like the classic dirty trick of being on the pill is that when that shifts a woman's hormonal profile, primes her to be seeking basically a new age wimp. A weak-chinned, safe provider for my children.
Non-aggressive, sexual.
Yes.
Yeah.
Low testosterone, like safe guy, right? Then they court, they do all the things, they lease a Volvo together, and then they get married. And she's like, okay, I'm going to get off the pill. It's time for us to start a family. She gets off the pill. She's like, brr, brr, brr. Who's this milk toast wannabe? I'm going to go shag a biker.
I need someone who's like, wants me.
Yeah. And that happens. And actually, women on the pill have higher marital dissatisfaction, higher propensity for divorce, all these kind of things, and also deadens libido and sexual response. And then throw in SSRIs, which completely clip eroticism, and like you're depressed.
SS what?
SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like Prozac and Zoloft.
Gotcha.
So you're like, okay, so why did I get on that stuff in the first place? Because I'm just not feeling connected to life. I'm not feeling right. I'm feeling down. I'm literally depressed.
Yes.
So now the very first thing we're going to do for you is completely take your sexual vitality, our entire biological reason for being, and we're just going to put that in the basement for as long as you're on this stuff. And people are attempting to live lives through that lie of the ball. And you're like, how do any of us maintain passion, connection, right, engagement with the deck that stacked?
Courage, everything.
Yeah.
So which goes back to what we were talking about before we started, which is step one, heal the past. It's like step one, and then what's the way to heal?
Yeah.
What's the modality that you'd use to heal your past or your shame or your trauma? What is something you do?
So we started building this kind of edifice, right? Yeah. Which was this notion of what is a global systemic reboot?
Yes.
And what are the pieces that can work? And we sort of said, here's the neurophysiology, brainstems, delta waves, nitric oxide, high vagal nerve tone, right? You can just do all these things, and they're all quite straightforward. If you want, you can even, and then pulse energy through the system. We talked about simple percussive energy with a Theragun.
Yeah.
You could use what's the word? Acoustic therapy, like sound waves. You can use
sound
light
baths. Everything. Yeah.
You can use light waves. You can use pain. You can use magnetism. You can use 12-volt electricity. You can use AC electricity. You can use orgasm. Right? All of those things cultivate energy and release through the nervous system. And as they do, they kind of, and this is a metaphor, but they sort of release or dislodge plaque.
Interesting.
In our system. And you could probably make a technical argument and TBD on which one of these would prove out, but quite possibly, you're sending out neurological signals, which would have the tendency to, cells that fire together, wire together, boosting neuroplasticity, myelination, so the sheaths and the communication structures kind of get woven in. I don't know if you've ever done any super fine grained, like PT, like rehab kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So have you ever had a physical therapist like make you do something crazy, like look in a certain direction and like scratch your thing?
All that stuff,
Right? And you're like, and like move this, and you're like, I don't even know how to get that muscle to fire, right? And then if they tap you or they pinch you or they do, you're like, oh, that's a signal, went to my brain, now I can maybe send one back, and you can kind of get yourself working again, right? So that's all we're trying to do. And
so all these things work.
They all work, and they work on a sliding scale. So let's just call this whole category hedonic engineering, right? So this is the idea of how do we learn to use neurosomatic information to optimize ourselves, right? And on the low end, you could say it's like a squeegee in your shower, right? Can I just discharge the stress that I accumulated in the last 24 hours? So I'm back to zero. And that is, and in fact, Nicole Prousey, I don't know, have you ever had her on? She's a former UCLA Kinsey Institute PhD sexuality researcher. And she's actually been researching orgasm as prescription pharmaceutical. And she says even, normally you would think of people who would be against that research as sort of, crypto-Puritans, right? Like the folks who are like, no, that's naughty and bad. But it's actually also she's found it with her colleagues, where she like, if someone comes home and masturbates to get to sleep, or after a hard day of work, this goes back to our monkey in Thailand, right? That's considered a dysfunctional coping mechanism. And she's like, no, it's not. and she's been researching to be able to actually, for pain relief, for emotional relief, all these things, the neurochemical cascade of orgasm as it happens. Again, Rick Doblin at MAPS, he and I were on a panel at the Battery Club up in San Francisco with Jason Silva, funnily. And we were just talking in between sets, and he's like, yeah, the closest we can tell, the prolactin, vasopressin, serotonin, oxytocin, and the openness, safety, security, belonging of the MDMA state that we're having all these off-the-hook responses with.
Right.
Closest thing we can tell is is to a post-orgasmic state. Mm-hmm. And you're like, And it kind of blew my mind because I was like, wait a second. You're like, this has been 30 years. This has been $40 million. This has been navigating the FDA and Byzantine clinical trials. And it's amazing and critical work. You're like, how else might we get people suffering to that exalted state known only to scientists as post-orgasmic? You're like, holy shit. And the reasoning is not sensational at all. It's that our erotic and ecstatic circuitry are foundational and bedrock to encoding primates to procreate. Mm-hmm. So our entire pleasure system is built on the substrate of our erotic arousal circuitry. Because if you think about it, for like millions of years, little monkeys figured out how to get busy with no instruction manual.
Right.
So it is outside of eating and breathing, and those are two other ones, right? I mean, like take eating out because we're not going to get into that, but breathing, that's why respiration is such a potent psychoactive tool, because we are hardwired to do it, and shifting the ratios of oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide in our system radically changes our consciousness. We can upregulate it, we can downregulate it, we can transcend it. Sexuality is right there next, which is like, now what's so, tragic, then beautiful, then really intriguing is that because it's such a strong biological encoder, it is responsible, I would guess, I mean, this is purely a, guess, but there's plenty of research to support the chunks of it, which is, I would think like 75% of human suffering comes down to our sexual programming, including war, conquest, rape, sexual, violence, everything. Wow. And I mean, people can contest that, but I would say at least half. And you think about it, you're like, oh my God, that's heartbreaking, but evolution is amoral, categorically amoral. Evolution doesn't give a about our vows, our promises, the better angels of our nature, our relationships. All it wants to do is just shake up the snow globe and create the most diverse, genetically viable gene pool it can get its hands on. And it will trick us into heartache, heartbreak, violence, and crisis all day long to get it. And you're like, okay, so yeah, I mean, even, and I want to kind of make sure we're tracking the dog legs we're taking because there's an important center theme to come back to. But even something like adolescence, right? That the fact that a young girl, and the numbers are sliding based on endocrine disruptors in our systems and various other things, but let's say a young girl reaches menstruation at 14 and adult cognitive maturity at 24. That is a decade, that is a gauntlet.
Whew.
That every young girl...
A lot of confusion.
Not only a lot of confusion, but by 24, prefrontal cortex is fully online, situational awareness, risk assessment, delayed gratification, all sorts of important things to keep her safe and making good choices, right? That decade is asymmetrically the window. It's like in Blue Planet, right? Off the coast of South Africa, where there's all the penguins and they got to swim between the islands, and that's where all the great whites are, right? That decade is asymmetrically the time for sexual abuse and trauma. And you're like, oh, that's horrible. And it's not something we would wish for our wives, our mothers, our daughters, our friends, anyone. And it's not just that, right? I mean, more and more sexual abuse and stories for young boys and young men is also coming out. So you're like, all of that is just the cold dictates of biological impulse. That is heartbreaking. But you're like, what if instead of being puppets on a string to an amoral evolution, you can take all that stuff and judo it over, have it jump the tracks, and use all of that neurological priming to heal our trauma, to access inspiration and peak states, and to bond and connect to the people we love and care about and are choosing to shoulder the burdens of life with together. Right. So let's do that. And that's profoundly empowering.
How do we do that?
Well, I mean, what we just talked about with this notion of a sort of a sexual yoga of becoming. And I don't want people latch onto that. It has, it's curious, it's potentially sort of sensational. there's almost always sort of three responses to this content. Because like once you take gloves off, and I'm a little bit, I fully confess to being slightly on the spectrum in the sense of I'm always just like, well, what is the case? And what does the evidence say? And if that's the case, then we should just say it,
right,
or just talk about it. So, but what I've noticed is that people come to this content, sort of, so respiration, embodiment, sexuality, substances, music. Like you put all this together, you're like, these have really strong biological drivers. So they're powerful, they're cheap, they're effective, they're consistent, they work. So everybody can use them. So they're starting to fit that case we're talking about with how do we design Meaning 3.0. But they're also powerful, volatile, riddled with cultural taboos. But then the thing is that if you're like, oh, back away, that's taboo, it should be the opposite. You're like, well, why is it taboo? It's taboo because they work. There's not a civilization worth its salt that hasn't had to put a tight lid on access to these things. So, I mean, respiration, I would say, there's not that many broadly acculturated respiratory practices. There's Kriya Yoga, there's a handful of others. Singing hymns, things like that. Even the Hail Mary, it's Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, right? That is a 9-second, 9 hertz, shift you into alpha wave entrainment protocol. So you could make a case, obviously no priest would have said this, but you could make a case that why Om Mani Padme Hum, the Tibetan mantras, there have been some fascinating studies on meditation and correlation with EEG waves and respiratory cycles based on whatever thing you're saying repetitively.
Interesting.
So you've got a mala bead, you're counting 108 rosaries or doing whatever you're doing, so you've offloaded prefrontal
You're getting into
cortical.
a state, yeah.
You're getting into a state, and you're actually putting yourself, and you're kneeling in front of votives with smells and bells and a patron saint. And it's not surprising that you might have an experience of awe, ineffability, etc. So as we approach this content, people are going to have an acculturated, triggered response. And it's going to fall into one of three categories. You'll be a hedonist, a purist, or a conformist. Those are three, at least these days, typical responses. So the hedonist is like, I'm all in, man, tell me more, right? Give me the cheat codes. And the challenge with the hedonist is that, what Jung said, like beware of unowned wisdom, like they're just up to their ears in it. And their challenge is, addiction and infidelity, because they want to go for everything and taste it all. And finding the brakes is their problem. They burn too hot, right? The purist, we'll do the purist next. The purist is actually the one who's like, my body's my temple, right? I don't need those, that's cheating and a shortcut. So any more volatile or intensive techniques or practices, and they actually have a spiritual materialism or a pride about their self-identity. So I meditate, I do yoga, I don't do those other things. I'm pure, that whole thing. And gas to actually accelerate their learning. They might have become self-satisfied, right? And they've actually stopped searching because they've actually created a fixed mindset around
this is the way, and
all the ways they do their things. And then the conformist sort of wouldn't know what to think. They're like, well, what does everybody else think? And specifically, what do medical, religious, and legal authorities tell me to think, right?
So what is the way
of
those three?
I'll check it out. So it's kind of nice, right? So for the conformist, right? I mean, they think nothing of having their kid on Ritalin, nothing of putting their spouse on Klonopin or Prozac, right? And knocking back 2 or 3 drinks every night to take the edge off,
right?
And maybe even smoking cigarettes, because that's all socially sanctioned or normative. But they would get divorced, and this is true. This isn't a hypothetical. I've seen this 3 times in the last couple of years. Couples getting divorced versus seeking MDMA couples therapy, which could have created some form of.
They get divorced without at least exploring different modalities.
Because I don't want to lose control. I'm terrified of losing control, and/or that seems beyond the pale.
So I'd rather get divorced than explore.
Yeah. For sure. And so for those guys, steering, getting out of the ruts of consensus opinion is their sort of weak link, right? But each of those folks has a core value, right? So the hedonist says, I value the fullest range of human experience and sucking the marrow out of life, right? The purist says, I value the sanctity of mind and body. And the conformist says, I value the evidence and the advice of experts. Right? So you're like,
do all of them.
Yes. So what if you pull them all together and stand up as hedonic engineers? Where you're like, okay, can we do all 3 of those things? Can we seek the full range of human experience with evidence and the advice and oversight of experts, and value and appreciate the sanctity of mind and body?
Right.
So that's the potential way, right?
What do you do to heal your traumas?
Yeah.
Personally, what does Jamie do?
What do I do?
And what was the hardest trauma to overcome?
Well, look, I mean, that's a deeper question and a really interesting one because, and I could be off base on this, but for me, my sense is there's micro and macro traumas,
yes.
probably for all of us, right? And
yep.
so we've talked about the
big T, the little T's.
The micro PTSD is the kind of squeegee out the impacts to my nervous system that accumulate through the day-to-day. And some of them can be but I can fundamentally...
The stress, the boss, the whatever, yeah.
But I can metabolize them. They are most destructive in the accumulation of them over time on process. But I can take the hits and the body shots as they come, right? So that I can get rid of via yoga, breathwork, hot, cold bathing, all the things, right?
And that's what you do?
Yeah. I mean, I'm also a lazy bastard, so we should put a pin in that.
But the big traumas, the big shames,
the deep ones there, there's two things. One is that full body brain system reset. So when I was describing that full stack, right, that spasming, and funnily enough, like the vagal nerve, which is just, that central piece, it's triggered by goggling, by choking, by humming, by vacating our bowels, by top and bottom. Like it's literally by spasming, retching, puking. Like if you've ever puked into a toilet and then had your eyes watering and you're like that's actually highly strong vagal stimulation. And you're like, oh my gosh, like us at our rawest, most revealed, most pathetic, we are also at our most profound. And you're like, wow. And that's such a scary, the same way like Tremor Release, people are like, I'm not gonna do that, that's a spaz, like I'm not spaz, I'm in control, like, right, that idea of like us like spasming, shuddering to discharge what's in us, right, is a potentially highly effective way to practice, this will be a mouthful of a word, but neurophysiological psychoarchaeology. Right? So using our neurophysiological, using our body and brain to conduct psychoarchaeology, which is to unearth the layers of our nervous system and our memory storage, to get down to both root pain and release it with the energy that is coursing through our system, flushing out plaque, right? Like the water pick for our soul, right? And then to come back to homeostasis, to come back to balance, and just, like if have you ever had like structural, like Rolfing or structural integrate, like stuff like that, and they're like, don't go lift any weights for the next couple of days, like just go for nice walks, wear some barefoot shoes, like that kind of thing, like, and let us come back
realign
to center. And so that process, and again, regardless of the methodology, but that process of deep brainstem reset, tremor release, and repack, and return to center. A sort of sacramental cadence, like a way for us to put this into our lives. We talked about the bell curve, 10%, should never touch the stuff, 80%. We talked about schedules of calendars through life. Fundamentally, all of these practices, like if we're going to hedonically calendar this, like how do we put this not just into a life, but like into our weeks and our months and our year, right? Then you can realize that these experiences serve three roles. They serve as metronomes, tuning forks, and training wheels, right? So the metronome part is, I've returned to center and I am now on the pulse, right? And that could be my coherent heartbeat. That could be my breath. That could be the sunrise and the seasons. That could be dancing with my lover. That could be, right, speaking my truth, right? I'm on the pulse. And I might have been galloping along, roused out, stressed out, trying to force it, and I was always kind of like pushing life, or I could have been depressed, lagging, slow, and always missing, right? So then I get, boom, I'm back on the one. And I'm like, that's the beat. Okay, that's good. I remember this now. I guess this feels familiar. And then there's the tuning fork, which is, we get banged up. Life, we take hits. We get knocked out of tune. And we might not know that we're sharp or flat. We might not know that there's just an edge to everything we're saying right now, but the people that love us do, and then ping, like there's the tuning fork, middle C, where's yours? And you're like, I thought I was in key. So like, Stevie Wonder, like songs in the key of life. So it returns us to that. And then the final part is training wheels, which is like, oh, what does it feel? What does balance feel like? Where I don't have to be afraid of protecting myself. And can I actually feel this for a moment and get used to it? And that's what the MAPS work with trauma sufferers has been, right? They experience MDMA as training wheels. And there was a beautiful report from one of the women who was in the study, and she's like, I didn't think that I could experience this anymore. I didn't think I deserved it. I didn't think I had it in me. And now I realize it's in me and it's mine. And it's not the drugs, right? It's in me.
So this reawakened that it was in me. Now it's in me.
Yeah, and so the metronome tuning force training wheels is like, this is how we begin again. And I think a key piece is that we're almost always sold a bill of goods, a happily ever after hockey stick utopian story. If you take this product, this pill, this workshop, this religion, if you do the things, it all works out happily ever after. And that's kind of what I meant about like the transcendental existentialism. No, it doesn't. No one promised us a rose garden, and no one's told us how this ends. And we really could be a bunch of lucky monkeys hurtling through the void as time and space. We just don't know. And anybody who pretends to is full of shit. But what we do know is that we have the chance, like life is equal parts, like we know life is tragic. Like that one's not that hard, but can we actually face the fullness of it in a way that ennobles us, right? Occasionally life is magic, and we forget that, right? But when we find it, it's like share the love and remember what we've forgotten. And whipsawing back and forth between those two is crazy making, right? So if we didn't have each other, right, to laugh with, like we can acknowledge it's comic as well. So it's tragic, it's magic, and it's comic, and that maps beautifully, right? Like the tragic, how do we address the tragedy? Through healing, through catharsis. The magic, how do we address that? That's through, how do we remember that, right? Through peak experiences. That's ecstasis. And the comic, how do we share the absurdity of this human condition with each other? And humor and lightness. And that's communitas. That's connection. So like that's the flywheel of our lives. There's no getting off this thing. And really only our efforts to escape all three. We cherry pick, right? We're like, oh, I'll take magic and comic for 1,000, please, Alex. You're like, no, not so much.
You need all three.
It's all three all the time. And sort of we're never fully fixed and we're never totally broken. But if we have the capacities, and that's why you mentioned earlier, like friends of ours who are forever going back to the wishing well, looking for the next breakthrough, looking for the next Shazam insight, but they're like up to their ears in those things, right? That may not be the path, right? It's like Dolly Parton, like there ain't no saint without a past and no sinner without a future. So you're just and back to redemption songs. We get knocked down and we get back up again. So like this thing is a process. And yet it's not simply like suck it up, fat kid.
Right.
It's not some bitter cynicism, right? To say that, because the magic is magic. And there is that process of like becoming, what in the traditions, sort of East and West, there's some version of like becoming twice born, right? Having a death rebirth experience, right? And what does that always say? I'm not going to pull a Joseph Campbell here and like just universalize, but the idea is like consistently, like Plato said, the Eleusinian mysteries teach us not only how to die a better death, but how to live a better life. Right? The early Christian Gnostic, same thing. Eastern traditions, Lakota sun dance, you name it, like all around the world is that death rebirth experience. And what I was sharing earlier.
Is it like an ego death as well? You mean identity death?
Yeah, I mean any and all of those things, but that stack, nitric oxide, vagal nerve, delta, cranial nerve, brainstem, reset, all that. That's actually the first time we've actually mapped the neurophysiological ingredients under the hood of all the world's wisdom traditions of death, rebirth, initiation. So now that we've mapped that, we're like, that's the neuroanthropology. You're like, oh, how are they doing this stuff?
Now it's applied.
Now let's look under the hood and understand the science behind it. Now we can do culture architecture. Now we got the Lego blocks. What do we want to build with the Lego blocks? And once you know that, then you have the experience to be like, oh, go see for yourself. This goes back to faith. So this is your seed from way back when, which was, how do we experience faith to overcome the grief? We can construct practices for ourselves, in our own homes, in our own relationships, in our own communities, in our own existing bodies of faith, or in new ones, whereby we can have that death rebirth experience, right? And actually come back a second time by choice, fully embracing and accepting the mystery and the responsibility and the possibility, and then choosing to be here fully. So it's like, go hunt your white whale. Like, he's out there. Like, if you really want to find God, the universe, and everything, right? Imminently searchable these days, more so than ever before. Scratch that itch. And when you're done scratching it, right? And hopefully it's sooner than later, because you need it. Come home. Come all the way home. And that notion of like anthropos is the Greek term. It sort of rolls into early Christianity as well. It's like Vitruvian man or Vitruvian human. Like fully integrated, fully balanced, heaven and heart, like heaven and hell, head and heart, masculine, feminine, right and left, like integrated human who's here. And like in Zen, they have the 10 ox herding parables, right? Which is like this metaphor for enlightenment. There's like 10 different beautiful pen and ink drawings. And like the dude's going, looking for enlightenment, finds it, and then there's all these super complicated distinctions, which I never understood. I'm like, damn, I like panel 4 was like, I was like, that's it, right? It's like, no, there's like a whole bunch more panels and there's a whole bunch more distinctions. But then like the 10th panel is this like fat little Buddha dude with a pot belly and a walking stick. And it says, his doors and windows are locked. Even the wisest sages and scholars cannot find him. He is down in the marketplace among the people with helping hands. Right? And so when enlightenment, when attainment, when anything fancy pants becomes so utterly ordinary, right, that it's no longer extraordinary, like when we can go from like waiting for the second coming to celebrating the umpteenth coming, like we're all in this together. No one gets out of here alive, and all of us or none of us. Like that feels like the greatest story ever told. And and back to Star Wars, right? We are hardwired for that story. Hardwired. I mean, Kurt Vonnegut, right? He wrote Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five, all those things. He has this beautiful, he did his grad work at the University of Chicago, and he mapped the shapes of stories. And like stories all have basic shapes. And he kind of laid them out. He's like, there's the up and the down, but there's rags to riches. You start out terrible and things end awesome. You've got boy meets girl, and it starts out meet cute. They break up, oh no, and they get together happily ever after. And then he's like, but the most popular one of all is the Cinderella story. And it starts out terrible, and it then goes, pumpkins and princes and stroke of midnight, and then ends up really even worse than ever. Everything's lost. Right, and then the foot fits the shoe, and princes and church bells and happily ever after forever. So it's down, then up, then really, really down, then really, really up. And you could make a case that we are in our own Cinderella story right now. We are at the stroke of midnight, right? The bulletin of atomic scientists who has the doomsday clock. They've been tracking it since like 1947, right? How close are we to snuffing it? It's the closest it's ever been. We're at 100 seconds to midnight in our very own Cinderella story.
True.
Right? So what comes next? And who writes this story for all of us and our children and their children?
Oh my gosh.
Right? Is on us. And like if you think of like Buckminster Fuller said, can we create a future that works for 100% of the people without offense to any? Right? In a world that we know is possible. And you're like, oh, okay. So this is really it. This is X-Wings and Death Stars. Right? This is Mount Doom and Mordor. Right? These are all the stories we know. Right? And we have not just our mythologies that we know in our bones. This is how it goes. Would we want anything less? If you had to pick when to show up in history, wouldn't you be like, I want to be the ones in triple overtime that sink the winning shot?
Right, of course.
Right? And it's going to be at a cost not less than everything. And it requires us at full strength. And it requires that we have to be able to heal. We have to remember what we forgot. We have to keep our eye on the prize. If we only focus on the tragic, then the mundaneness of the world will crush us.
Yeah.
But if we only focus on the magic, then the burning bush will burn us. Right? And we have to do this together. Like we have to walk each other home.
So I'm curious then, what's the biggest trauma you've had to overcome?
I mean, I think being a misfit toy. You know?
You being a misfit toy?
Yeah.
From your parents or something? Or
Well, from everything, like South African mother, English father, then moved to America, dropped into Catholic school, like being like 2 years younger than all the kids in my class, just being like, what the hell is this thing, and who are these people, and what are their strange customs, and why don't I fit, right? And so my sense is that as we do this growing up thing, right, you can shed, it doesn't take too much support or perspective or insight to be like, oh, I'm doing that, that's totally unconscious, I should clean my room or do the dishes or make my bed or stop being an asshole or stop withdrawing and hiding from somebody's, we're running away from emotional intimacy or something, right? And you can shed those, and most well-intentioned, mature folks tend to. But then there's this kind of like this core, it's sort of like who we actually are. And then you start getting to that place that's more like a bee with a stinger, where you're like, oh, okay, so that's a definite drawback. It creates unfortunate things in my life. But if I take it out, I disembowel myself. Like it is the shadow of actually the rest of my light. And so now
it's pushing me also, it's driving me also.
Yeah. And if I got rid of that, I would actually be lobotomizing what is my potential gift.
Interesting.
So now how do I live with that and also just generally not be so like how do I right? Because you could say, let me or leave me, take it or leave it, which I think is inadequate.
So how do you heal it also and live with it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean,
How have you, or what has that process been like for you?
Well, I mean, look, first of all, my filter is my family, and they are hard judges, right? So in fact, I can actually, this is an interesting point, because this is the sort of a thought experiment or a model on how we become twice born, or how we become homegrown humans, right? So I was at the kitchen table with my wife, Julie, and we've been together since college.
Wow.
So we grew up together, and we were kind of going at it. Like it was about as intense a conversation as we typically have.
Recently? When was this?
Yeah, this was like a year ago.
Okay. Pre-COVID?
Yes, although funny story about that, we were talking last week, and we were first time we'd got to really connect heart to heart about our relationship in a while, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it felt like we started drifting. I don't know, was it like 6-9 months ago? Sometime in this thing, I just felt a little less close to you. And then she's like, yeah, like a year ago, COVID happened, and then the wheels came off life. I was like, oh, that was it. Like that was, I had completely forgotten in my relational map that COVID happened, and it might have had some impact, which was just like, but a year ago, before COVID, we were having there were times in the first few years, like teenagers still, where I just did some dumb, stupid things and left scar tissue in a relationship. Of course, we had processed them at the time, paved over that, here we are. Yeah. But nonetheless, still in the mix. And
still there.
Still somehow in the mix, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I find obviously we were super young, and we are each other's relational history for the most part, which in some respects is a blessing. There's nothing else in the closet. But on the other hand, it's like it's all
you
us
guys,
all the time, right? But she was really still anchored on some of that, just kind of core places I hadn't been fully supporting her, right? And yet we had also just had these amazing and profound breakthrough experiences where it felt like our life was as complete as we could ever hope, want, or dream. And I was like, what are you doing? Like, why are you dragging us back in the past? Like, here, we've already won.
Right,
like,
we're here.
Like, we got there. Like, it worked, right? And at first I was like, oh, like, here's this timeline, our like mythic life, and you're stuck down on our biographical life, and you're anchoring off past trauma. And stupid, like, we're up here, we won.
Right.
Come with me up here. And I was like, that's not quite right, is it? Because that's like a bit of a bypass, and this is our life. We actually live it and lived it.
Experienced it.
So we have to honor that. Like, so I was like, what's that about? And I was like, oh, well, maybe we can like meet them. Maybe we can braid them. And then I was like, oh, okay. So now I had this kind of thought of, and I even started sketching it, and it looked like a Jesus fish, right? You know those arcs, right? And they cross the tail. You see more bumper stickers, on minivans. And I was like, oh. So this is like the DNA Jesus fish. You're like, it starts at our birth, and where the tail crosses, that's our death, physical death or initiatory death rebirth. We all have our biographic life. That's the arc of our life, right? And it does actually slump downwards. Like all the happiness studies are like 20 to 40 is your 30 to 50 is your suckiest time.
Really?
People say, oh, kids are the best thing ever. Like all happiness studies say folks in your 20s are super stoked and folks in their 50s are super stoked and everybody in between is in a sufferfest, right? So anyway, but that's beside the point, right? And along the way, we have trauma. We get our adverse childhood events and our adverse life events. So you can just sort of see those dots along the way. If we're lucky or skillful, mostly just lucky, we'll have a peak experience. It could be a camp out and you see shooting stars or a full moon. It could be your first rock concert and everybody's holding up lighters or phones and everybody's sync belting out the chorus. Like, yes, this is it.
This is
right?
epic.
It could be your first love. Take our picks, and you have one. Okay, that's one data point. You think that was amazing. I look back on it fondly, but
how do I get more of that?
There's no pattern recognition. But you get back two times, then you get back 3 times. Now 3 points make a trend. And there might be 3, 4, 5 of those, and you're suddenly like, oh, I connect the dots backwards. I can actually see this arc, and it actually starts feeling like a bit of a story, and it's my story, and it's my mythic story. It's like me at my highest, my best self. Right. A lot of people go way off the reservation on this, like, oh, I've recovered past lives, or oh, I'm actually a star being, or oh, I'm something, right? But it's just because we like, hey, let's just call it, this is your mythic life. This is you at full strength, maximum imaginable possibility. And now I've got a plot there. Now what happens is people start exploring this, especially as they get into strong, unstructured, ungrounded access to ecstatic technologies, right? And certainly psychedelics are an easy example of that, but not the only one. They will get out of phase. They will get out of time with their partners. And this is what was happening with me and Julie. So I was on our leading edge in mythic life. She was anchoring off our bleeding edge in biographic life. Right? And so people will come back from a meditation retreat, a personal growth workshop, a psychedelic experience. They're like,
it's
I
amazing.
fucking figured out, I solved it, I love you, everything's going to be different. It's amazing, I'm amazing, you're amazing, I'm sorry. And what will happen quite often is that the people we come home to, like, slow your roll, like not so fast, like I'm suspicious or I'm judgmental or I'm skeptical or let's see if this sticks.
I don't trust you,
Let's see if this sticks. And the person who's just had that peak experience is often quite like, this is the new me, this is who I always have been, this is who I am most truly deeply, this is it. And they often dissociate from all the past places they might have had a hand in, right? The past trauma. So, but the person who's been holding the home for it is like, until you get down off your high horse and shovel some shit, I'm not willing to trust you and come along for the ride of your life. Like if you want me to come along for the ride of my life, you actually have to come back and make amends. And so that's, we literally are meat suits, we're sitting across a table together, but we're actually unstuck in time from each other and from painful pasts or fantastic futures. So the leading edge gets out of phase with our bleeding edge. So we really need like 4D psychology, which is not just here's me and I'm me and you're you, but when are we? Right? When are we? And if we can get into the deep present together, then beautiful consistently. Right. Insight, truth, connection, inspiration, all sorts of
intimacy, everything,
everything, right? And so if over time we can repeat that process via the flywheel of peak states that remind us what we've forgotten, right? Deep healing, because they don't just do that. Peak states seem to do 2 things. They seem to remind us what we forgot. The technical term is anamnesis. You're like, oh yeah, I remember. Almost dropped that stitch. How could I have? Duh. That's the whole point. But they also give us like a printout of our like homework. Like here, it's like an electrician running like juice through your system. Like you got a blown fuse, a crimp wire. Go fix this shit. Right. So we do our homework and catharsis, and then we validate it with each other. Right. And because we're outside lineages, because we're outside of having people tell us what to do or deferring to authority these days, we do still have each other, and then that's what keeps us honest, and that's what keeps us human. Right? So you could be like Saul, you know, like Paul from the road to Damascus. He's like, oh yeah, that Saul guy, you know, he was a total son of a bitch and a tax collector, and I get it. I mean, he's a dickhead, but I'm Paul, baby. You know, can't you see? And she's like, yeah, no, I mean, he's still a son of a bitch, and so let's wait. But if we do it over time, then we braid the mythic life. We bend the mythic life down, and it becomes more of our embodied experience because we've integrated and done the hard work. But we're also lifting up our biographic life. And then you get to that death rebirth experience. And rather than that being the end of our physical lives, right, we get to have it early. And then you're like, okay, so now I'm no longer struggling to get off the hook. right? I am no longer trying to transcend or bypass my life, right? I'm actually embracing it fully. I'm shouldering my yoke, right? And that, I mean, this is, mildly esoteric, but it's too beautiful not to share, which is, the biographic life is chronos, like the Greek term for like clock time, right? Past, present, future in order. Life's a bitch and then we die. And then sacred time, right? What we experience when we glimpse our mythic lives is called kairos. And in the esoteric traditions, like kairos is the vertical beam, that's sacred time, and chronos is the cross beam, right? And we live on that plane, but we can have access to this one. And when we find ourselves at the intersection, that's what the Rosicrucians, right, called the rosy cross. That is anthropos. That is timeless Christ consciousness. And you're like, oh, neat. So can we bear witness to the tragic, to the magic, to the comic, right? And then can we live out the remaining chapters of our life, right, with joy, with grace, with creativity, right? Because we know how it ends. I mean, now we'll finish with faith, right? So Elton Trueblood, who was a Quaker theologian, he was a Stanford chaplain, he was also advisor to Dwight Eisenhower, he played a huge role in he was one of the few Anglos to be advocating against the Japanese internment camps, all kinds of neat stuff. And he said something, and he was actually the grandfather of my college roommate and best friend. So I've known this quote for 25 odd years. He said, faith then is not belief without proof, right? So it's not a superstition, but rather it's trust without reservation, right? So we get to have that initiatory experience, right? And it reminds us of what is always deeply and eternally true. And in some respect, from time to time, I wouldn't say this is consistent, but it shows up in the literature of subjective self-reports. There is something known as eschatasthesia, which is a persistent sense of the eschaton or the end of time, right? And when people seem to glimpse it, there is a kind of curiosity of like, it all works out.
Yeah.
Don't know how.
Yeah,
Triple overtime.
somehow it all works out.
51-49, nail biter, but somehow, right, Jordan pulls the three, right? And whether that's true, whether that's fiction, whether that's synaptic discombobulation in a total hallucinatory state, TBD. But folks can come back from that experience saying, hey, I know how it all works out, right? And we're getting to come back to play out these middle chapters. We've seen the end of the movie, right? So we can relax a little. But here's the thing, it's not like Calvinist predestination. You're not like, oh, we're already saved or we're already damned, so like close my eyes and hands off the wheel, I don't need to try, right? It's 49-51. Which means every single calorie between here and there counts. Right. Which means we're still 100%. So we're off the hook of like neurotic wonderings about, is there something more? Do I have a place? Do I have a purpose? But we're on the cross, right? Of Kairos and Chronos to say, I bear witness. I bear witness to this full catastrophe. And on behalf of the least of my brothers and sisters, right? And to pull that around, right? That we talked about soul force, right? That Martin Luther King phrase, and how he got it from Howard Thurman, right? That badass mystic who went to see Gandhi. And this is crazy. I was interviewing Rick Doblin from MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and out of nowhere he just blurts this out. He's like, "Oh, you know that Good Friday experiment, which was that famous experiment in like 1962 or 3 at Harvard at Boston Chapel, where they gave a bunch of Harvard Divinity School students psilocybin." During a Good Friday service. And everybody knows that story. It's one of the most well-reported ones. It's been replicated at Johns Hopkins. And they could not tell the difference between who had had a legitimate mystical experience and who'd been on the psilocybin. And actually, none of the folks in the control group went on to become ordained ministers, and 8 of the 9 who had psilocybin did. So very, very interesting study, right? And everybody kind of knows that part of it. And then Rick, just out of nowhere, he's like, "Oh yeah, by the way, you know who the chaplain was delivering the sermon? Howard Thurman." So I was like, what? You gotta be kidding me. I was gonna write about Howard Thurman anyway. That's amazing. Let me dig up the audio. And they recorded it.
Wow.
So there's Howard Thurman, this badass who shaped the entire African-American civil rights movement, who coined the term soul force, and he tells this story to a chapel full of tripping mystics. He says, "I hear a voice crying out in the wilderness, forgiveness. And I go out to see him, and I find a man on the cross. And I say, I have to take you down. He says, you cannot take me down. You cannot take me down until every man, woman, and child comes to take me down. He says, tell everyone you meet, there's a man on the cross. There's a man on the cross. And you're just like, right? Tell everyone we meet, right? It's time to stop waiting for the second coming, right? And it's time for us to step up, right? Every man, woman, and child.
Wow.
And you know, the beautiful part of it is that if we can learn to weep and not whimper, right? If we can digest our grief, if we can remember our redemption songs, then we don't just get to limp each other home or walk each other home. We get to dance each other home, right? This gets to be profound celebration. But the longer we delay, the harder the landing.
Yeah.
And the sooner we get on this, right, the more joyful and creative what we create next for our Cinderella story can be.
Yeah. Wow. I wish we could go for much longer, but I think this is a lot for people to take on right now.
Dude, that's a lot. And I'm right at, it's 2:30, is it already?
That's 1:30.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah,
Sweet. Okay.
That's why I was looking at my clock, because I was like,
Yeah.
and we were in a flow state. This is a lot for people to unpack.
Yeah.
I had a lot more questions and things I wanted to go over, but I think this is a good place to land the plane.
Yeah.
Recapture the rapture, rethinking God, sex, and death in a world that's lost its mind. This is going to blow your mind in a big way, so make sure you guys get a copy of this. I've got a couple final questions to wrap things up. One is called the three truths question. I ask everyone at the end, hypothetical question. I'd like you to imagine it's your last day on Earth, many years away from now. You get to live as long as you want.
Oh, nice.
You get to accomplish everything you want to accomplish.
Okay.
But for whatever reason, you have to take everything with you created to the next place.
Okay.
So all the books, the writing, the videos, it all goes with you wherever you go
with you, like
after.
King Tut.
It all goes with you.
All right.
Hypothetical. But you get to leave behind 3 lessons to the world. This is all we would have to remember you by, are these 3 lessons that you've learned from all your experiences, and this is all we could know of you. Or I like to call it 3 truths. What would you say would be your 3 truths?
Well, I mean, it's even more like 3 truths. This is literally what picks me up off the floor when I am destroyed by staring at the screaming abyss and feel like there's no point to any of it.
What is that? Yeah.
It is seek novelty, make art, help out.
Okay, there you go. Help out.
Yeah. Because seek novelty is, we're hardwired for dopamine, we're hardwired for newness. And whenever I feel like I'm festering, it's because my novelty meter is way low.
You're doing the same thing over and over, yeah.
Sunrises, sunsets, new places, new experiences, go seek novelty. Make art is some form of testimony. It's like, can I rail against the second law of thermodynamics and that everything trends towards entropy and decay over time and a cold heat death of an uncaring universe? So build something beautiful.
Yeah.
And that could be a garden, that could be a poem, that could be a building, but make art. Like, say, I was here. I made this place a little more good, true, and beautiful. And then finally, and if I've figured out the first 2, share it.
Yeah. That's cool. It's good truths. I want to acknowledge you, Jamie, for your constant seeking of wisdom, from science to ancient philosophy, to bringing it all together for something that we can hopefully apply and use for healing trauma, for understanding this earth, for understanding connection, why we're having massive breakdowns in the world, what to do about it for ourselves, and how to help others. So I acknowledge you for doing this work. I remember Jason Silva telling me probably 4 or 5 years ago about you, and it's been fun to watch your journey and see what you've created with this book, which is going to blow people's minds. So I acknowledge you for doing the hard work, for diving into the misfit that you are and were growing up, and allowing it to be a beautiful piece of art for right now, because I'm sure there was a lot of things that had to happen for you to be here. So I acknowledge you for making this art and sharing it with the world in a beautiful way. My final question, and people can get the book online, they can go to your site. Where can we go and find this book and you and
Yeah, I mean,
online?
obviously, if you've got a local independent bookstore, share the love for sure.
Yeah.
And then obviously Amazon and everything else works just fine. And recapturetherapture.com is a place to find the book, but also find tools, resources. The intention is for this book to seed a revolution, not lead one, and let 1,000 fires burn. So we have an open source toolkit for anybody to play with culture architecture and help healing, inspiration, and community wherever you are.
recapturetherapture.com. What about on social media? Are you spending a lot of time on anywhere specifically?
Yeah, on Instagram, it's at Flow Genome, and then on Facebook, Flow Genome Project. I think will probably be this.
That's your main focus? Cool. Final question for you. What's your definition of greatness?
Oh, nice one. Nice one. Let's try and come up with something that's original. I mean, honestly, I think it is seeking refuge in the Dharma, like the thing that's yours and yours alone to do. So like in a like Marvel Comics, it's Thor's hammer, right? It's impossibly heavy for anybody else to touch, but yours, it's the same as Excalibur. Like find your hammer, take the sword out of the stone and wield it with courage and compassion, and let the chips fall.
My man. Jamie, thanks, man. Appreciate it. Powerful. If you're looking for more greatness in your life, make sure to check out this video right here. And also check out our free PDF, The 3 Secrets to Unlock the Power of Your Mind to help you change your life. Download it right here.
An inadequacy is a pathway that you can travel down. What should I do with my life? That's a real complicated question. Oh, here's an inadequacy.